tracker on a child's ankle. Not a hospital band, not a school ID, a GPS device. Military grade, bolted tight enough to leave bruises on skin that hadn't even finished growing yet. And the man who put it there? He smiled when he talked about her, called her my little investment, wore $1,000 shoes and shook hands with judges. Nobody questioned him. Nobody looked twice. Until a drifter on a rusted Harley walked into the wrong diner on the wrong night and heard 4 words that burned through every wall he'd spent 20 years building around his own broken heart. Daddy counts my steps. This is the story of what happened next. Stay with me until the end. I promise you, this one's going to hit different. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The storm had been threatening since noon, but it hadn't committed yet. Just hung there, a wall of bruised sky pressing down on the highway like a hand on the back of your neck. Jax Mercer rode through it anyway. He always rode through it. 22 years on 2 wheels had taught him that weather was just weather, and pain was just weather too, if you kept moving long enough. His Harley was older than most marriages, a '98 Road King with a cracked headlight cowl, mismatched saddlebags, and an exhaust note that rattled windows from a quarter-mile out. The chrome was pitted in places, buffed raw in others. It looked the way Jax felt, held together by habit and stubbornness more than anything resembling hope. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, maybe the day before. Time blurred when you were running from nothing in particular toward nothing at all. The iron serif patch on his back, a skeletal angel with spread wings stitched into cracked leather, was the only address he'd had in 6 years. No apartment, no mailbox, no phone plan. Just the road, the club, and whatever forgotten stretch of America unfolded under his front tire next. The diner appeared like a mirage. One of those places that existed outside of time, a flat-roofed cinder-block rectangle with a neon sign that said Dales, in letters that buzzed and flickered like a dying heartbeat. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and dead weeds. A pickup truck with a Confederate flag toolbox sat at one end. A black Mercedes SUV sat at the other, gleaming and out of place, like a diamond dropped in a gutter. Jax killed the engine. The silence after a long ride always hit him like a physical thing, a pressure in the ears, a ringing that took minutes to fade. He swung his leg over, planted his boots on the ground, and stood there for a moment, letting the blood return to his hands. His knuckles were swollen. His left knee popped when he straightened it. 44 years old, and his body kept a ledger of every mile, every fight, every night spent sleeping on concrete or frozen ground. The smell hit him before the door even closed behind him. Burnt coffee, fried onions, floor cleaner that didn't quite cover the cigarette smoke soaked into the ceiling tiles from decades of before the band regulars. A country station played low from somewhere behind the counter, all steel guitar and somebody's broken-down love story. He took a booth near the back. Habit. You never sat with your back to the door. You never sat near the window. You picked the spot where you could see everything, and everyone could see you were the kind of man they didn't want to bother. The waitress was somewhere north of 60, with a smoker's voice and a name tag that read Doreen. She brought him coffee without asking, set down a laminated menu with a stain that might have been older than him, and didn't make small talk. He liked that. Most people talked too much. Filled the air with noise because silence scared them. Silence didn't scare Jax. Silence was where he lived. He ordered the meatloaf. Didn't care if it was good. Calories were calories. That's when he saw the girl. She was sitting in a booth across the room, diagonal from him, pressed against the window like she was trying to melt into the glass and disappear. Small. Blonde hair that looked like it had been cut with precision but hadn't been washed in a couple days. Maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. Hard to tell with kids who'd learned to make themselves smaller than they were. She wasn't eating. There was a plate in front of her, grilled cheese, untouched. But her hands were in her lap, and her shoulders were drawn up to her ears in a posture Jax recognized immediately. Not from any training manual, from his own childhood. The posture of a child waiting for the next hit. The posture of someone who had learned that the space between stillness and movement was the most dangerous territory in the world. Across from her sat a man. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck that probably cost more than Jax's entire wardrobe, including the boots. His hair was styled in that effortless way that required a $60 product and 40 minutes in front of a mirror. He had the look of money. Not new money, not flashy money, but the quiet kind that came with power and never needed to announce itself. Marcus Vale. Jax didn't know his name yet, wouldn't learn it for another 3 days, but something about the man registered in the part of his brain that never turned off. The part that had been sharpened by 3 combat tours and 16 years of living on the margins of a world that had no use for men like him. It wasn't what Marcus was doing that set off the alarm. It was what he wasn't doing. He wasn't looking at the girl. He wasn't talking to her. He wasn't eating. He was looking at his phone, but not casually, not the way a bored parent scrolls through news. His eyes moved with the precision of someone monitoring data, tracking something. His thumb didn't swipe. It stayed still while his eyes followed a moving point on the screen. Jax looked at the girl again. She hadn't moved. Not an inch. Not a fidget. Not a reach for her water glass. Not even the involuntary twitch that kids her age couldn't suppress. She was statue still in a way that no child could achieve naturally. She was performing stillness. She had been trained to disappear. His meatloaf arrived. He ate it without tasting it, keeping his eyes on the booth across the room. 20 minutes passed. Marcus never looked up from his phone. The girl never moved. Doreen refilled Jax's coffee and glanced at the booth with something flickering behind her eyes. Something that looked like concern buried under years of minding her own business, in a town where minding your own business was the primary survival skill. Then the girl moved. It happened fast. She slid out of the booth, but not to leave, just to go to the bathroom, her body language said. And as she rounded the end of the table, her foot caught the leg of a chair. She stumbled. Not a fall, just a trip. A tiny loss of balance that sent her lurching sideways. She caught herself on the edge of Jax's table, her small fingers gripping the formica, her face suddenly inches from his. And he saw it. Her right ankle, just above the line of her sneaker. A slim black band, smooth, flush against the skin, with a tiny green LED that blinked once every 2 seconds. Not a bracelet, not a medical device. A tracker. The kind of hardware Jax had seen in military contexts. The kind that transmitted GPS coordinates, movement vectors, biometric data. The kind that you bolted onto assets you couldn't afford to lose. On a child's ankle. Their eyes met. Hers were gray. Not the warm gray of overcast skies, but the cold gray of concrete. Old eyes in a young face. Eyes that had seen things no child should have to catalog. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not words, not understanding, but the raw animal recognition of one caged thing seeing another. Her lips moved, almost no sound. A breath shaped into words. Daddy counts my steps. Then Marcus's voice cut across the diner like a blade. Lily. One word. Not loud, not angry, worse than both. The calm, measured tone of a man who never needed to raise his voice because the threat was always understood. Lily flinched like she'd been slapped and released the table. She walked back to the booth with the mechanical precision of a soldier reporting for inspection. Sat down. Hands in lap. Shoulders up. Eyes forward. Marcus still didn't look up from his phone. He didn't need to. The phone told him everything. How far she'd walked, where she'd stopped, probably what her heart rate was doing. Jax's hands were shaking, not from caffeine, not from cold, from something older and darker. A rage that lived in the basement of his chest, behind the locked door he'd spent 2 decades learning to keep shut. The rage that had first ignited when he was 9 years old and his mother's boyfriend had locked him in a closet for 16 hours because he'd spilled milk on a library book. The rage that had driven him into the Marines at 18. The rage that had gotten 3 men killed in Fallujah because he couldn't tell the difference between protecting civilians and annihilating the men who hurt them. The rage that AA meetings and VA counselors and a decade of self-medication with whiskey and highway wind had never quite managed to extinguish. He watched Marcus and Lily leave. The Mercedes pulled out of the lot smooth and silent, headlights cutting through the first drops of rain. Jax sat in the booth for another hour, his coffee going cold, the neon sign outside buzzing its broken rhythm against the glass. Doreen came by to clear his plate. That man and the girl, Jax said. They come in often? Doreen's hand paused on the plate. Once a week, maybe. Thursdays, usually. She always that quiet? Doreen set the plate down, looked at him with eyes that had 60-plus years of accumulated caution in them. Mister, I've worked this counter since before you were born. I've seen things I wish I hadn't, and I've learned to keep my mouth shut about every single one of them. That's not an answer. No, she said. It ain't. She picked up the plate and walked away. Jax paid his bill, rode through the rain to a motel 12 miles down the highway where the Iron Seraphs had a standing arrangement with the owner. Half-price rooms, no questions, no police calls. He lay on a bed that smelled like bleach and stale smoke and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. Daddy counts my steps. He didn't sleep. 3 days. That's how long he lasted. 3 days of riding back roads and telling himself it wasn't his problem. 3 days of stopping at gas stations and staring at missing children posters and knowing that most kids who needed saving weren't on any poster because the person they needed saving from was the one who'd reported them safe. 3 days of that little voice, the one he'd drowned in bourbon and exhaust fumes for 20 years, screaming at him from the bottom of a well he thought he'd sealed shut. Thursday evening, he was back at Dale's. He told himself it was the meatloaf. It wasn't the meatloaf. The meatloaf was terrible. He took the same booth. Doreen brought him coffee without a word. The country station was playing a different song, but it sounded exactly the same. Rain streaked the windows. The neon buzzed. The world outside was dark and wet and indifferent. They arrived at 7:14. The Mercedes parked in the same spot. Marcus opened Lily's door. Not out of courtesy, Jax realized now, but to maintain control of the transition between the car and the building. Lily walked 2 steps behind him. Precisely 2 steps. Never more, never less. A distance that had been measured and enforced until it became automatic. They sat in the same booth. Marcus ordered for her. A children's menu hamburger, no fries, water instead of juice. He didn't ask what she wanted. She didn't expect to be asked. When the food arrived, she ate slowly, mechanically, never reaching for anything that wasn't placed directly in front of her. Jax watched the ritual unfold and felt the architecture of it reveal itself. The precision, the control, the meticulous engineering of a life designed to produce absolute obedience. Marcus didn't hit her. Jax was almost certain of that. Men like Marcus didn't need to hit. They built systems. Walls, rules, technology. They turned a child's entire existence into a panopticon where the threat wasn't violence but the total annihilation of autonomy. Every step counted, every sound monitored, every deviation logged and punished in ways that left no bruises for a social worker to photograph. This was something worse than abuse. This was ownership. At 7:41, they left. Jax waited 90 seconds, dropped a 20 on the table, and walked out into the rain. The Mercedes was already a quarter-mile down the county road, taillights bleeding red through the downpour. Jax kicked the Road King to life and followed. He stayed back. No headlight. He knew these roads well enough to ride by feel, by the ghost-white line at the edge of the asphalt, by the rhythm of the curves he'd memorized over years of aimless riding. The Mercedes turned off the county road onto a private drive marked by a stone pillar and a mailbox with no name. Jax killed the engine and coasted into a thicket of dead sumac 50 yards from the entrance. He walked the rest on foot. The drive wound through dense pine forest for nearly half a mile before opening onto a clearing. What sat in that clearing made Jax's stomach turn. The house was beautiful. That was the worst part. A sprawling 2-story colonial with white clapboard siding, black shutters, and a wraparound porch with rocking chairs. American Dream postcard. But around that postcard ran an 8-foot privacy fence topped with angled brackets that held taut steel wire. Security cameras mounted every 40 feet, their red indicator lights blinking in the rain like predatory eyes. The driveway ended at an electronic gate with a keypad and what looked like a biometric scanner. Motion sensor floodlights bathed the perimeter in cold white light that turned the raindrops into needles of silver. This wasn't a home. This was a containment facility dressed in Martha Stewart wallpaper. Jax crouched in the tree line for 40 minutes, rain soaking through his leather, his bad knees screaming, his breath coming out in white clouds that he had to time between the camera sweep patterns. He counted the cameras. 12 visible. Probably more he couldn't see. He noted the fence line, the gate mechanism, the floodlight coverage gaps. Old training kicked in. Not the kind they taught in classrooms, but the kind that lived in your muscles and your teeth after enough nights spent in places where being seen meant being dead. Through a gap in the curtains of a second-floor window, he caught a glimpse of Lily, standing in a room that was bare except for a bed and a small desk. No posters, no toys, no color. She stood at the window looking out at the rain, her palm pressed flat against the glass. Jax made it back to his bike without being seen, rode to the motel, sat on the bed with his boots still on and his jacket dripping onto the carpet. He pulled out a burner phone, the only phone he carried, prepaid, no name attached, and dialed a number he knew by heart. The voice that answered sounded like it came from the bottom of a gravel quarry. "Yeah. Bear, it's Jax." A pause. The sound of a chair creaking. "You dead?" "Not yet." "Then what?" Jax told him. All of it. The diner, the girl, the tracker, the house, the cameras, the fence. He told it flat, without embellishment, the way he'd been taught to deliver field reports. Facts only. Let the listener make the judgment. When he finished, the line was silent for a long time. "You sure about the tracker?" Bear said. "I've seen that hardware on military assets. That thing is broadcasting real-time biometric data. Heart rate, location, movement patterns, probably audio." "On a kid." "On a kid." Another silence. Then Bear's voice came back, lower. "Come home. Tomorrow. We'll sit with it." "Bear." "Tomorrow, Jax. Come home, and we'll sit with it." The line went dead. Home was a compound 40 miles northeast of the diner, down a logging road that didn't appear on any commercial GPS. The Iron Seraph Clubhouse was a converted sawmill that the club had bought at tax auction 15 years ago and rebuilt with their own hands. Concrete block walls, steel roof, a main hall big enough to hold 200 men, and a workshop that smelled permanently of motor oil and welding flux. Behind it sat a row of small cabins that members used between rides, a communal kitchen that was always producing either coffee or chili, and a fire pit ringed with mismatched chairs where the real conversations happened after midnight. Boone "Bear" Callahan was standing in the doorway when Jax pulled in, 6'4", 270, with a beard that had gone gray before his hair and hands that could crush a beer can or cradle a newborn with equal facility. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, come home to a wife who'd emptied their bank account and disappeared, lost his civilian welding job to a back injury, and spent 3 years living in a van before he'd found the Seraphs. Now he was their president. Not because he wanted the title, but because nobody else could carry the weight of it without breaking. He didn't greet Jax, just handed him a tin mug of black coffee and walked inside. The main hall was half full, despite it being a weeknight. That told Jax something. Bear had made calls. Riggs Teller Branson was there, the club's tech specialist, a former NSA contractor who'd had a nervous breakdown at 31 and walked away from a 6-figure clearance to fix motorcycles and build surveillance countermeasures in a sawmill. Cade Northcutt, the club's sergeant-at-arms, sat cleaning his reading glasses with a bandana, a quiet man with burn scars up his left arm from an IED in Kandahar, and a reputation for strategic thinking that bordered on terrifying. 6 or 7 others occupied chairs and bar stools, all of them watching Jax with the particular stillness of men who had been told something ugly was coming and were bracing for impact. Bear sat at the head of the long oak table that served as the club's unofficial war council. "Tell it again," he said. Jax told it again, same facts, same flat delivery. But this time, when he got to the part about the tracker, the blinking green LED on a 7-year-old's ankle, the room changed. The temperature dropped, not literally, but in the way that a space full of damaged men contracts when something touches the nerve that never healed. Every man in that room had a version of that nerve. The father who used fists, the uncle who came into the bedroom, the foster home that was worse than the streets, the system that was supposed to protect and didn't, the childhood that was survived but never recovered from. Teller was already on his laptop. "Describe the band again." Jax described it. Slim, black polymer, flush-mounted LED, no visible seam or clasp. Teller's fingers moved across the keyboard. There's about 4 companies that make that kind of thing for commercial use. 2 of them are defense contractors. If it's doing real-time biometric plus GPS plus audio, you're looking at something custom, not consumer grade. This is the kind of hardware they use for high-value intelligence assets, or what? Bear said. Teller looked up from the screen. His face was the color of old paper. Or people who are being trafficked and need to be monitored remotely by someone who can't afford to lose their investment. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jax had ever heard. Cade spoke first. His voice was quiet, methodical. You said he drove a Mercedes. Get the plate? Jax shook his head. Partial. First 3 characters. I can go back. Don't go back alone, Bear said. I've been going alone. And now you're not. Bear's voice left no room for discussion. We need to know who this man is before we move. Name, address, financials, legal history, custody records if there are any. And we need to know what that tracker is and who's receiving the data. Teller nodded. Give me 48 hours. You have 24. Cade leaned forward. There's another question nobody's asking. Where's the mother? The room went quiet again. Because that was the question, wasn't it? Every story about a controlled child had a missing chapter, and that chapter was almost always a woman who had either been destroyed or erased, a mother who had fought and lost, a mother who had been bought off or threatened into silence, a mother who was in a grave somewhere with a death certificate that listed natural causes, and a coroner who didn't ask too many questions. I'll find her, Jack said. Bear shook his head. We'll find her. Together. That's how this works. Jack stared at the table. He wasn't good at this. The together part. 20 years of solitary drifting had calcified something inside him, turned the parts that were supposed to connect to other people into scar tissue. The Marines had taught him to function in a unit, but that was operational, mechanical. This was different. This was men looking at him across a table and saying, "We see you and we're not leaving." It was the hardest thing in the world to accept. Harder than combat. Harder than withdrawal. Harder than every freezing night he'd spent on the side of a highway, convincing himself he didn't need anyone. Okay, he said. One word. But in that room, among those men, it meant everything. Teller worked through the night. By morning, the picture that emerged was worse than any of them had imagined. Marcus Vale, age 47, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. A financial consultant with an office in the state capital, client list that read like a who's who of regional wealth management. He'd been appointed as Lily's legal guardian 3 years ago after her mother, a woman named Catherine Marrow, had died in what the county coroner ruled an accidental prescription medication overdose. Lily's father had died before she was born. No siblings, no living grandparents, no family at all except Marcus, who had been listed as Catherine's financial advisor and, subsequently, as the executor of her estate. The estate was substantial. Catherine Marrow had inherited a portfolio of commercial real estate from her own father, properties in 3 states, generating passive income that Teller estimated at somewhere north of $2 million annually. All of it now held in a trust with Marcus as sole trustee and Lily as the sole beneficiary. He's not raising her, Teller said, his face illuminated by the blue glow of 3 overlapping monitors. He's warehousing her. She's worth more alive and under control than she would be adopted, out or emancipated. As long as he maintains guardianship, he controls the trust. He controls the money. The second she turns 18 or the court appoints a different guardian, he loses everything. So she's a hostage, Cade said. She's an asset, a living, breathing bank account that he keeps in a cage. Bear hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He sat in his chair with his coffee gone cold, staring at the wall where a row of framed photographs showed the club's history. Men on motorcycles, men at cookouts, men standing shoulder to shoulder at funerals. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What about the mother's death? Teller pulled up a screen. Coroner's report says accidental overdose, oxycodone and alprazolam. But here's the thing. I can't find a single medical record showing Catherine Marrow was ever prescribed either of those medications. The room absorbed that. You're saying she was murdered, Jack said. I'm saying the coroner's report doesn't match the medical history. That's what I'm saying. Bear stood. The chair scraped against the concrete floor. Every man in the room straightened involuntarily, not from fear, but from the gravity that Bear carried when he moved with purpose. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Nobody moves until I say. Nobody goes near that house. Nobody contacts authorities. Not yet." "Bear," "Not yet." He looked at Jax. "I know what you're feeling. I know what every man in this room is feeling. But if we go in wrong, that girl disappears into a system that already failed her once and will fail her again. We do this right, or we don't do it at all." He walked out into the morning light, the door closed behind him. Through the window, Jax watched him stand in the gravel lot between the clubhouse and the cabins, his massive frame silhouetted against a pale sky, his phone pressed to his ear. Jax sat with the silence. Around him, the other men did the same. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They were all sitting with the same thing. The image of a little girl standing at a window in a bare room, her palm pressed against cold glass, wearing a device on her ankle that told a man who might have killed her mother exactly where she was at every moment of every day. And the question that none of them could answer yet, what would it cost them to set her free? And what would it cost them if they didn't? 24 hours later, Jax was back at Dale's, not for surveillance, not for the meatloaf. He was there because he couldn't stay away. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw gray eyes in a small face and heard 4 words in a voice barely louder than breath. Doreen poured his coffee. This time she sat down across from him. Didn't ask permission, just sat. "You came back," she said. "I came back." She studied him. The leather, the patch, the scars on his knuckles, the eyes that never stopped scanning the room. "You're not the first one to notice," she said quietly. "About the girl." Jax's hand tightened around the mug. "Who else noticed?" "I did. 3 years ago when he first started bringing her in, called social services. They sent someone out, nice lady with a clipboard and a smile, came back and told me the home was clean, the child was fed, and I should mind my own business. You called again?" "Twice more. Third time, they told me if I kept filing false reports, they'd pursue charges against me." Doreen's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "That's how it works out here, honey. Money talks. Everybody else shuts up." Jax looked at her, really looked, past the smoker's wrinkles and the tired eyes and the uniform that smelled like fryer grease. He saw a woman who had tried, who had done the thing you're supposed to do, call the people who are supposed to help, and been punished for it, threatened for it, silenced. "The system failed her," Jax said. "The system was never built for girls like her. It was built for men like him." Doreen stood up. "Whatever you're planning to do it soon. Last week she came in with a bruise on her wrist she tried to hide under her sleeve. I've seen that before. It always gets worse. It never gets better on its own." She walked back to the counter. Jax stared at his coffee. His phone buzzed. A text from Bear. 2 words. "Come now." He rode through a night that smelled like pine and frozen mud, the Road King's headlight cutting a tunnel through darkness so complete it felt like riding into the throat of something alive. The clubhouse was lit when he arrived. Every window blazing, the parking area packed with bikes he didn't recognize. Not just local chapter. Regional. He counted plates from 4 different states as he rolled in. The main hall was standing room only. He stopped in the doorway and felt the air hit him. The heat of 60, 70, maybe 80 bodies packed into a space that suddenly felt small. Leather and sweat and coffee and motor oil. The smell of men who had ridden through the night to be here. Bear stood at the head of the table. Beside him, a woman Jax had never seen before. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back tight, wearing a navy blazer over a white shirt. No jewelry, no makeup. Eyes that were simultaneously exhausted and completely focused. "Sit down," Bear said. "Everybody sit down." Men found seats, leaned against walls, crouched along the edges. The room compressed. "This is Agent Merritt," Bear said. "Federal. She's been looking at Marcus Vale for 19 months. The woman stepped forward. She didn't introduce herself again. Didn't smile. Didn't try to build rapport. She looked at the room full of bikers and saw exactly what she needed to see. Manpower. "Marcus Vale is not one man with one child," she said. "He's a model, a template. We've identified 11 cases across 6 states where financial guardians have isolated minor beneficiaries for the purpose of controlling inherited assets. Vale is the most sophisticated. He's also the most dangerous because he's the one the others learned from. She paused. Let that sink in. 11 children, she said. 11 cages. And every time we've tried to move through conventional channels, courts, social services, law enforcement, the cases collapse. Witnesses recant. Judges develop sudden sympathy for well-dressed men with clean records. Evidence disappears from databases overnight. Jax watched her face. She was telling the truth. He'd spent enough years reading people in situations where misreading them meant dying to know the difference between performance and pain. This woman had been fighting a war for 19 months and losing. What do you need? Bear said. Agent Merritt looked at him. I need something that money can't buy and lawyers can't outmaneuver. I need 175 men to stand in a place where they're not supposed to be, at a time when nobody expects them, and make it impossible for Marcus Vale to pretend that the world isn't watching. The room was silent. Bear turned to the assembled men, veterans, drifters, mechanics, fathers who had lost custody, sons who had never known their own fathers, men who had been broken by the world and put themselves back together with engine grease and brotherhood and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. You heard her, Bear said. We vote. And 175 hands rose in the air without hesitation. Bear nodded, just once, the way he always did when the club made a decision that couldn't be taken back. Thursday, he said, moonless night. Then he looked at Jax. And something passed between them, not words, not strategy, but the simple, devastating acknowledgement that whatever happened next would change every man in this room forever. And somewhere 40 miles away, behind an 8-foot fence and 12 surveillance cameras and an electronic gate designed to keep the world out, a little girl stood at a dark window with her palm pressed against the glass, counting her own steps in a house that had never been a home, unaware that 175 broken men had just promised to tear down every wall that held her. The only question left was whether they could reach her before Marcus realized they were coming. Thursday came too fast. 3 days of preparation that felt like 3 hours, and every one of those hours carried the weight of something none of them could name. Not fear exactly. Fear was simple. Your body telling you to run. This was something heavier. The knowledge that once you stepped across a certain line, the ground behind you dissolved, and the only direction left was forward into whatever was waiting. Jax hadn't slept. Not really. He'd lain on the cot in his cabin, staring at the ceiling while the compound settled into its nighttime rhythms around him. The distant clank of someone working on an engine in the shop, the murmur of voices around the fire pit, the occasional bark of a dog that had wandered in from the woods and been adopted by men who understood strays. His mind ran the same loop over and over: the diner, the gray eyes, the tracker, the window, the palm pressed against glass. And underneath all of it, the thing he wouldn't say out loud, the memory of his own hand pressed against a closet door at 9 years old, counting the hours in the dark, waiting for someone to come. Nobody came. Not then. Not for years after. He was pulling on his boots at 4 a.m. when the cabin door opened without a knock. Cade stood in the frame, the early dark behind him, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a manila folder in his hand. "We have a problem," Cade said. Jax looked at the folder. "How big?" "Big enough that Bear needs to hear it before anyone else moves." Cade stepped inside and closed the door. The cabin was small. A cot, a footlocker, a wooden chair, a window that looked out at the tree line. No decoration except a photograph tacked to the wall with a bent nail. A woman in a sundress standing on a pier somewhere sunny. Jax's mother, taken before everything went wrong. Cade glanced at it and looked away, the way men did when they recognized pain they weren't invited to touch. "Teller pulled Marcus Vale's phone records," Cade said. "Not the ones on file. The ones he tried to bury." "And?" 3 calls in the last 72 hours to a number registered to the county sheriff's office. Not the main line, a personal cell belonging to Sheriff Dean Purcell. The name landed like a stone in still water. Jax knew Purcell. Not personally, nobody in the club dealt with the man directly, but by reputation. A third-generation lawman in a county where the badge was treated like a family heirloom. Connected, protected. The kind of small-town authority who had dinner with judges and drank bourbon with prosecutors and played golf with men who owned the kind of money that made problems disappear. You're telling me Vale has law enforcement in his pocket? I'm telling you Vale made 3 calls to Purcell in 3 days. One of them lasted 47 minutes. People don't talk to a sheriff for 47 minutes about weather. Jack sat on the edge of the cot. The springs groaned. His hands hung between his knees, fingers laced, knuckles white. Does Bear know? I'm walking there now. Wanted you to hear it first. Why me? Cade looked at him for a long moment. The burn scars on his left arm caught the light from the single bulb overhead. The skin pulled tight and shiny in a way that made you think about what heat does to a human body when there's nowhere to run. Because you're the one who started this. And if it goes sideways, you need to understand what sideways looks like before it hits. They walked to the clubhouse together. The gravel crunched under their boots. The air smelled like pine sap and coming frost. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. That high, broken sound that always seemed to be asking a question nobody could answer. Bear was already in the main hall. Of course he was. Jack sometimes wondered if the man slept at all or just sat in that chair like a mountain waiting for the next earthquake. He had a topographic map of the area around Vale's estate spread across the table, weighted at the corners with coffee mugs and a Leatherman tool. Teller was beside him, laptop open, 3 energy drink cans lined up like soldiers. Cade set the folder on the table. Tell him. Teller did. The phone records. The calls to Purcell. The 47-minute conversation that happened exactly 14 hours after Agent Merritt had briefed the club. Bear didn't move. Didn't speak. Just sat with his hands flat on the table, staring at the map like the contour lines might rearrange themselves into an answer. The silence stretched so long that Jax could hear the tick of the old industrial clock on the wall and the settling of the building's steel frame in the cold. Does Merritt know? Bear finally said. Not yet, Teller said. I wanted to bring it here first. Why? Teller hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack in the floor. Because if Purcell is compromised, we need to ask who else is. Merritt's been running her investigation for 19 months and hasn't been able to close a single case. Witnesses recant. Evidence disappears. That doesn't happen because of bad luck. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jax felt his stomach drop. You think Merritt's dirty? I think we've known this woman for 48 hours, Teller said. She walks into a biker clubhouse, tells us exactly what we want to hear, and asks us to deploy 175 men to a location she specified on a timeline she chose. If I was setting a trap, that's exactly how I'd bait it. That's a hell of an accusation, Bear said. It's not an accusation. It's a question. Teller closed his laptop. His face was drawn, the skin under his eyes bruised from 36 hours without sleep. I used to build these kinds of operations for a living. Walk-ins who offer exactly the right intelligence at exactly the right moment are the ones you interrogate hardest. It's basic tradecraft. Bear looked at Jax. What do you think? Jax thought about Agent Merritt's face, the exhaustion, the controlled precision of her words, the way she'd looked at the room full of bikers without flinching, without performing. I think she's real, he said. But I've been wrong before. You've been wrong a lot, Cade said quietly. Not cruel, just factual. And that was the other thing they hadn't talked about yet. The thing that had been sitting in the room since Jax first walked into the clubhouse with his story about a girl in a diner. The last time Jax had gone all in on a rescue. Tulsa. 4 years ago. A woman at a truck stop with a black eye and a story about a boyfriend with a gun. Jax had ridden in like the broken cavalry he was, confronted the boyfriend, and learned too late that the woman had set him up. The boyfriend was a meth cook with connections to a distribution network, and Jax's interference had triggered a chain of events that ended with 2 Seraph members in the hospital and a 23-year-old prospect named Danny Voss taking a shotgun blast to the chest that collapsed his left lung and ended his riding career permanently. Danny Voss, who was 27 now and worked at a hardware store in Decatur and still couldn't breathe right when the humidity dropped. Nobody mentioned Tulsa. But everybody was thinking about it. Jax could feel it in the way Cade wouldn't quite meet his eyes, in the way Teller's questions had an edge that wasn't just professional caution, in the way Bear looked at him, not with doubt exactly, but with the careful assessment of a man who had to weigh one person's conviction against the safety of 175. "I'm not wrong this time," Jax said. "Tulsa," Cade said. Just the word, flat as a tombstone. "This isn't Tulsa." "It's always Tulsa until it's over." The door banged open. A gust of cold air knifed through the hall. A man stood in the doorway, mid-50s, lean as a fence rail, with a graying ponytail and a face that looked like it had been carved from drought-cracked earth. Reno Garza, road captain. The man responsible for organizing every formation ride the Seraphs had ever run. He was breathing hard, his leather jacket spotted with rain, his eyes wide in a way Jax had never seen on a man who'd ridden through a hurricane without changing expression. "We got eyes on us," Reno said. The room contracted. "Where?" Bear said. "County Road, quarter-mile south of the access road. Unmarked sedan. 2 men. They've been sitting there since midnight." "Law enforcement?" "Plates come back to a municipal fleet. Could be sheriff's office. Could be anyone who has access to those vehicles." Bear stood. The chair didn't scrape this time. He rose like something tectonic, slow and inevitable. He walked to the window and looked out at the compound. The bikes lined up in rows. The cabins dark. The workshop silent. 175 men spread across the property, most still sleeping, all of them trusting him to make the right call. "We've been made," Teller said. "We don't know that," Bear said. 2 men in an unmarked car outside our compound the night before we're supposed to move? We know it." Jack stood up. "I'll go talk to Merritt." "Sit down," Bear said without turning from the window. "Bear, I said sit down." This time Bear turned, and for the first time in all the years Jax had known him, there was something in Bear's face that he couldn't read. Not anger, not fear. Something older. Something that looked like the weight of every decision he'd ever made pressing down on him at once. "You don't go anywhere alone. You don't contact anyone outside this building. You don't move until I have a clear picture of what we're walking into. That girl is in that house right now. I know where she is. Then you know we can't sit here and—" "What I know," Bear said, his voice dropping to the register that made strong men go still, "is that I have 175 men who trust me to bring them home alive. I have a federal agent I can't verify. I have a county sheriff who may be working for the target. I have an unmarked surveillance vehicle sitting on my road. And I have you, standing in my hall, telling me to move fast, which is exactly what you told me before Tulsa." The words hit Jax like a fist, not because they were unfair, because they were true. He sat down. Bear turned to Reno. "Keep eyes on that sedan. Rotation. 2 men, 4-hour shifts. If they move, I want to know before they know." Reno nodded and disappeared into the dark. Bear turned to Teller. "Get me everything you can on Purcell's relationship with Vale, financial connections, property records, shared associates, and find out if Merritt's investigation has any connection to the sheriff's office." "On it." Bear turned to Cade. "Wake the officers. Full table in 1 hour. Nobody else hears about this until we've decided what to do." Cade stood, paused, looked at Jax. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not accusation, but the raw acknowledgement that the past doesn't stay past, and the dead don't stay buried, and every man in every room is always one mistake away from becoming the thing he's trying to outrun. Then Cade walked out. Bear and Jax were alone. The clock ticked. The building creaked. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing dead leaves across the gravel in dry, skittering sounds that made the compound feel like the deck of a ship in rough seas. "You think I'm compromised," Jax said. "I think you see yourself in that girl." Bear sat down heavily. "And I think that makes you capable of things that are either very brave or very stupid, and right now I can't tell which. It doesn't matter what I see. It's the only thing that matters. A man who's fighting for someone else can be strategic. A man who's fighting for his own reflection is reckless." Bear leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his voice lower now, almost gentle in a way that was somehow worse than his authority voice. "Tell me about the closet." Jax's entire body went rigid. What? The closet. Cade told me, years ago, you were 9. Your mother's boyfriend locked you in a closet for 16 hours. Cade had no right. Cade had every right. He's your brother. He told me because he was worried about you. Because he saw the same thing I'm seeing right now. A man who never got rescued, looking at a girl who needs rescuing, and losing the ability to tell the difference between her situation and his. The silence that followed was different from the tactical silences of the last hour. This one was personal, intimate. The kind of silence that exists between the moment you realize someone is seen through every wall you've built and the moment you decide whether to let them in or burn the bridge. Jax's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached, his eyes burned, not tears. He hadn't cried since he was 12 and had made a promise to himself that he'd broken only once, the night Danny Voss had gone into surgery in Tulsa. This was something else. The heat of a wound being touched for the first time. 16 hours, Jax said. His voice was barely there. The lock was a deadbolt. I could hear them on the other side of the door. My mother was crying. He was telling her I needed discipline. She didn't open the door. He paused, breathed. The air tasted like rust. I was 9 years old, and I waited 16 hours for someone to open a door, and nobody came. Bear said nothing, just sat, just listened. The way only a man who had his own closet and his own 16 hours could sit. That girl is standing at a window, Jax said, counting her steps, wearing a tracker that tells a man who might have killed her mother exactly where she is every second of her life. And you want me to sit here and wait because the last time I tried to help someone, I got it wrong? I want you to sit here and wait because getting it wrong again means she disappears. Vale has the resources to relocate overnight. If he gets wind that we're coming and we're not ready, that girl is on a plane to somewhere we'll never find her. You don't get a second shot at this. Jack stared at the table. The wood grain swam in his vision. I need to know you can hold, Bear said. Not for me, not for the club, for her. Can you hold? A long breath, the longest of his life. I can hold. Bear nodded. Then hold. The officers' meeting lasted 4 hours. It was the most contentious table session in the club's history. Reno reported that the unmarked sedan had been joined by a second vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows parked a half-mile further down the road. Teller presented financial records showing that Sheriff Purcell owned a hunting cabin that had been purchased through a shell company whose registered agent was Marcus Vale's law firm. The connection was undeniable. Purcell wasn't just aware of Vale's activities, he was invested in them. The debate fractured along a line nobody expected. Half the officers wanted to abort. The operation was compromised. Law enforcement was hostile. Moving forward meant walking into a potential ambush with 175 men who had families, jobs, parole conditions, and lives that could be destroyed by a single arrest. The smart play was to hand everything to Merritt, let the federal system handle it, and walk away clean. The other half said walking away meant Lily stayed in that house, and every man who voted to abort would spend the rest of his life knowing that he'd had the chance to open a door and hadn't. The argument went in circles. Voices rose. Fists hit the table. Cade, normally the calmest man in any room, stood up so fast his chair fell backward. We're not an army, he said. We're not law enforcement. We're a motorcycle club. We ride together and we look out for each other, and sometimes we do things that the world doesn't understand. But we do not send 175 men into a situation where we can't control the outcome. Not again. Again. Tulsa. The word hung between them like a blade. Cade, Bear said. No. I watched Danny Voss bleed out on a parking lot because we moved on bad intelligence and a good heart. I will not do that again. I will not carry that again. His voice cracked on the last word, just barely. Just enough for every man at the table to feel it in his own chest. Jack stood. The room went silent. Then don't, he said. Don't carry it. I'll go alone. The hell you will, Bear said. You heard Cade. He's right. The club can't afford another Tulsa, so don't make it the club's problem. Make it mine. I go to that house alone. I document what I find. I bring it to Merritt and let Federal handle the rest. You'll be arrested before you get within 100 yards of that fence. Then I'll be arrested. One man, one charge, No club exposure. The table erupted. Men talked over each other, pointed fingers, slammed palms flat against wood. Bear let it burn for 30 seconds, then raised his hand. Silence fell like a hammer. "Nobody goes alone," Bear said. "That's not how we're built, and that's not how this ends." He looked around the table. Every face, every scar, every set of eyes carrying damage and determination in equal measure. "Teller, can you get a message to Merritt without going through channels that Purcell can monitor?" Teller thought for a moment. "Encrypted satellite. I've got a burner sat phone from the old days. It's clean." "Do it. Tell her about Purcell. Tell her about the surveillance on our compound. Ask her one question and one question only. Can she guarantee federal jurisdiction supersedes county? If Purcell tries to intervene, can she shut him down? And if she can't," Bear's jaw tightened, "then we have a different conversation." The waiting was the worst part. Worse than riding through gunfire. Worse than detox. Worse than every dark morning Jax had spent bargaining with a version of himself he no longer recognized. They waited 6 hours for Merritt's response, and during those 6 hours, the compound vibrated with the particular tension of men who have committed to something they can't take back but don't yet know the shape of. Jack sat in his cabin, stared at the photograph on the wall, his mother in the sundress. She'd been 26 in that picture, younger than some of the prospects in the club. She'd died at 41, liver failure, the official cause, though the real cause was a decade of men who used her up and threw her away, and a system that treated her like she was the problem rather than the victim. Jax had been in Afghanistan when it happened, got the Red Cross notification 3 days after the funeral, flew home to an empty apartment with a box of her things that fit in his footlocker. There was no closet in the world deep enough to bury that. At 1400 hours, Teller knocked on his door. Merritt responded. Jax followed him to the main hall. Bear was there. Cade was there. The officers were there. And on Teller's screen, a message that changed everything. Federal warrant issued, Purcell under separate investigation, financial corruption, obstruction, conspiracy to defraud a minor. U.S. Marshals notified. Federal agents would be on site at Vale's property within the operational window. Merritt's instruction was precise. The Sheriff's role was civilian presence, non-violent, non-confrontational, a wall of witnesses that no local authority could disperse without federal consent. They were to arrive, surround the perimeter, and hold position until federal agents executed the warrant. "She's real," Jack said. "She's real," Teller admitted. Bear read the message twice, 3 times. Then he looked up. "She's asking us to be the thing we've always been," he said. "Men who show up." Nobody laughed. Nobody cheered. That wasn't how it worked. What happened instead was something that Jax had witnessed a dozen times in his years with the Sheriffs, and that never stopped shaking something loose inside him. One by one, every man at the table nodded. Not enthusiastic nods, not performative nods. The slow, deliberate nods of men who understood exactly what they were agreeing to and were choosing to do it anyway. "Thursday still the night?" Reno asked. "Thursday's gone. Purcell knows something's moving. We go tonight." The room froze. "Tonight," Cade said. 2200 hours, full chapter. Every writer, no exceptions. Bear stood. "Reno, I need a route that avoids every road that sedan and SUV have line of sight on. Teller, kill every tracking device on every phone in this compound. I want us invisible. Cade, gear check. No weapons. I mean 0. Not a knife, not a wrench, not a chain. We go clean, or we don't go." "And the surveillance vehicles?" Reno asked. Bear paused. For the first time all day, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Send 8 bikes out the front gate at 2100. Loudest pipes we have. Let them chase noise while we move through the back." Reno grinned. The first genuine expression Jax had seen on the road captain's face in 3 days. The compound became a machine. Every cabin door opened. Every man emerged. The word spread not through announcement, but through the particular current that runs through a brotherhood when action replaces deliberation. Boots on gravel, engines turning over in the shop, the clink of thermoses being filled, the zip of leather jackets being pulled from hooks. No speeches, no war cries, Just 175 men getting ready to ride through a winter night toward a house that held a child who had never been free. Jack stood in the doorway of his cabin and watched it happen. The organized chaos, the precise disorder, men checking tire pressure, adjusting mirrors, taping over anything reflective. Teller moved between bikes with a handheld scanner, sweeping for GPS trackers that might have been planted during the surveillance. Reno huddled with 3 other riders over a hand-drawn map, plotting a route through logging roads and fire trails that would bring them to within half a mile of Vale's estate without touching a single paved road. Cade appeared beside him. They stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. 2 men watching their brothers prepare for something that had no name except the right thing. "I was wrong earlier," Cade said. "About what?" "About Tulsa." Cade paused, adjusted his glasses. "Tulsa wasn't your fault. It was bad luck and bad information and a situation that went sideways because situations go sideways. I put that on you because I needed someone to blame, and you were the easiest target because you already blamed yourself." He turned his head, looked at Jax directly. "Danny Voss doesn't blame you. I talked to him last month. He said to tell you he bought a boat." Jax's throat closed. He couldn't speak. He just nodded. That same slow, deliberate nod. And Cade nodded back. And something that had been broken between them for 4 years clicked into place with the quiet precision of a bone finally set right. At 2100, 8 bikes roared out the front gate. The loudest, most obnoxious machines the Seraphs owned, straight pipes, no baffles, engines tuned to scream. They turned south on the county road and rode directly past the unmarked sedan and the black SUV, revving hard enough to rattle windows, their headlights blazing, their presence unmissable. A decoy so obvious it was almost insulting. Within 4 minutes, both surveillance vehicles pulled out and followed. At 21:45, the back gate opened. 175 motorcycles rolled out in single file. No headlights, no engines. Every bike pushed by hand, every man walking beside his machine in total darkness, boots silent on the dirt logging road, the only sound the soft click of chains and the creak of leather and the breathing of men who had decided that tonight the locked door would open. Jax pushed his Road King through the dark. The handlebars were cold under his bare hands. Ahead of him, Bear's massive silhouette moved like a shadow against shadows. Behind him, the line of men stretched back into blackness, an army of ghosts rolling their machines through a forest that smelled like pine and frozen earth and the sharp electric scent of something about to change forever. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They reached the staging point at 2230, a clearing in the woods half a mile from Vale's estate, where the logging road dead-ended at an abandoned gravel quarry. 175 bikes parked in silence. 175 men stood in the dark. Bear raised his hand. Every man saw it. Every man went still. In the distance, through the trees, the glow of Vale's security lights painted the low clouds with a cold white haze. Somewhere in that glow, behind the cameras and the fence and the biometric lock and the tracker on her ankle, Lily was in her room, standing at her window, or lying in her bed, or counting the steps from wall to wall because counting was the only thing that was hers. Bear's hand dropped. 175 men began to walk. And at that exact moment, 2237 on a moonless Thursday night, in a county that had protected Marcus Vale for 3 years, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first, Agent Merritt's convoy of federal vehicles turned onto the county road from the north, running dark 16 minutes ahead of schedule. The second, every light in Marcus Vale's estate went black. Every camera, every floodlight, every electronic lock. Total darkness. And from somewhere inside that darkness, the sound of a child screaming. The scream tore through the darkness like a blade through silk, high, thin, ragged at the edges. The sound of a child whose terror had finally outrun her ability to contain it. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it cut off. And the silence that replaced it was worse than the scream itself, because silence after a scream means one of 2 things. The danger has passed, or the child has stopped being able to make noise. Jax was running before his brain caught up with his legs. The forest floor was uneven. Roots, rocks, frozen ruts left by logging trucks years ago, and he stumbled twice in the first 50 yards, his boots catching on terrain he couldn't see. The darkness was total. Vale's estate had been a halo of white light against the clouds just seconds ago. Now it was a black hole cut into the landscape, swallowing everything, giving nothing back. Behind him, the sound of 175 men moving at once. Not running, you can't run silently through a forest, but surging, the collective lurch of a body of men whose plan had just been obliterated by a 7-year-old's scream. Discipline held, barely. Bear's voice cut through the dark, low and hard as a hatchet strike. Hold formation, nobody breaks the tree line until I say. Men stopped. Jax didn't. Jax! Bear's voice again, closer now. A hand caught his shoulder, massive, iron-strong, the grip of a man who could pull an engine block with his bare hands. Hold. She screamed. I heard it. Let me go. Not yet. Bear, listen to me. Bear's face was invisible in the dark, but his voice was right there, inches away, and it carried something Jax had never heard in it before. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the terrible lucidity of a man who is calculating in real time and doesn't like what the numbers are telling him. The power didn't go out. It was killed. Someone cut it deliberately. That changes everything. Jax's breath came in ragged pulls. The cold air burned his lungs. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples, his wrists, the scar tissue on his knuckles. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to move, to run, to find the girl, to rip through fences and walls and anything that stood between him and that sound. But Bear's hand on his shoulder was an anchor, and somewhere beneath the animal panic, the soldier in him recognized the logic. A power cut wasn't a malfunction. It was a tactical move. He knows, Jax said. Yeah, Bear said. He knows. From the direction of the county road, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. Merritt's convoy, running dark, still a quarter-mile out, too far, too slow. And somewhere inside that estate, in a house that was now as dark as the closet Jax had spent 16 hours in at 9 years old, a man who had killed before was alone with a child whose value had just shifted from asset to liability. Teller appeared at Bear's side, his face lit blue by a handheld device. The tracker. Lily's ankle tracker. It just went offline. The signal dropped at 22:38, same time the power cut. He killed the power to kill the tracker, Cade said from somewhere in the dark. He doesn't want anyone to know where she is. Or where he's taking her, Teller said. The words hit the group like a shockwave. Taking her. Not hiding, not waiting, running. Marcus Vale had known they were coming, maybe from Purcell, maybe from his own surveillance, maybe from some tripwire they hadn't found. And his response wasn't to defend. It was to disappear. And a man who disappears with a child he's been caging for 3 years doesn't take her to another house with a white picket fence. He takes her somewhere permanent. Bear released Jax's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The deliberation was gone. What remained was the command voice, the one that had guided men through firefights in mountains where the enemy knew the terrain better and the extraction was always 12 hours late. Reno, take 20 men, circle north, cover the back of the property. There's a service road that runs along the eastern fence line. If he's running, that's his exit. Copy. Tell her. Get Merritt on comms. Tell her the situation has changed. We need federal on the ground now, not in 16 minutes. Already dialing. Cade, you're with me and Jax. We go to the gate. Everyone else holds at the tree line. No one enters the property until federal arrives or I give the word. Bear paused. And if I give the word, it means something has gone wrong enough that the rules don't apply anymore. Understood? A murmur moved through the darkness. Not agreement, something raw. The sound of men who had signed up for a peaceful show of force and were now standing in a forest listening to the echo of a child's scream and understanding that the night had teeth they hadn't planned for. Jax, Bear, and Cade moved through the trees toward the estate's main gate. The ground sloped downward. Branches scratched at their leather. The cold was the kind that crawled inside your jacket and nested against your spine. Jax's bad knee sent a bolt of pain up his thigh with every step, and he ignored it the way he'd ignored pain for 22 years, by converting it to fuel. They reached the fence line. 8 feet of steel privacy fencing, the angled brackets at the top now barely visible against the sky. The cameras were dead. No blinking red lights. The floodlights were dead. The electronic gate stood inert, its keypad screen black, its biometric scanner dark. Cade moved along the fence and found what he was looking for in 30 seconds. A junction box mounted at the base of the fence, its cover pried open, wires severed cleanly. Not ripped, cut. With a tool. With precision. He planned this, Cade said quietly. This isn't panic. This is a contingency. The gate was locked, but without electronic power. The magnetic lock was just dead weight. Bear gripped the frame with both hands and pulled. The metal groaned. Cade joined him. Together they forced a gap wide enough for a man to slip through. Jax went first. The darkness on the other side was different, denser. The estate's landscaping, hedges, ornamental trees, a gravel path that wound toward the porch, created shapes that could have been anything. Shadows that moved when you looked at them sideways. Jax's combat training took over. He moved low, fast, heel to toe, his eyes adjusted to the dark enough to make out the porch railing, the front steps, the door. The front door was open. Not ajar. Open. Wide open. As if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't cared about appearances because appearances no longer mattered. Jax stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. The sound was obscenely loud in the silence. He stood at the threshold and looked into a house that was perfectly dark and perfectly still and smelled like furniture polish and something else, something acrid, chemical, like cleaning solution used to erase something specific. "Lily," he called. Not loud, just enough to carry through the first floor. His voice sounded wrong in this space. Too human, too alive for a house that felt like a mausoleum. Nothing. He stepped inside. Bear and Cade followed. Cade produced a pen light, narrow beam, red-filtered, and swept it across the foyer. Hardwood floors. A staircase curving upward. A hallway leading deeper into the house. Everything immaculate. Every surface clean, every object in its designated place. Except one. On the hallway floor, just past the staircase, a child's sneaker. Small. White. The left one. Lying on its side as if it had been kicked off or fallen during a struggle. Jax picked it up. It weighed nothing. It was warm. "She was here," he said. "Minutes ago." Bear was already moving down the hallway. The penlight swept rooms as they passed. A study with a desk and 3 monitors, all dark. A kitchen with granite counters and a single glass of water sitting on the island, still sweating condensation. A mudroom with a door that led to the back of the property. The mudroom door was also open. Beyond it, the back lawn stretched toward the eastern fence line. And beyond the fence, barely visible, a pair of taillights. Moving. Red pinpoints in the dark, heading down the service road that Reno was supposed to be covering. "Reno," Bear said into a handheld radio. Static. "Reno, come back." Static. "He's jamming us," Teller's voice crackled through, distant, distorted, fighting through interference. "Some kind of broadband signal can't." The transmission died. Jax was already through the door, running across the back lawn, the sneaker still in his left hand because he couldn't make himself put it down. The grass was frozen stiff and crunched under his boots like broken glass. The eastern fence had a section that had been cut, a clean rectangular opening in the steel panels large enough for a man and a child to pass through, the edges bright with freshly exposed metal. On the other side, tire tracks in the mud. Fresh. Deep. A vehicle that had been parked and waiting. He'd had an escape route the entire time. While Teller was mapping cameras and Reno was plotting approach vectors and Bear was holding counsel, Marcus Vale had been 3 steps ahead. A contingency plan built on the assumption that someday someone would come. A dead man's switch for the life he'd constructed. Kill the power, cut the fence, take the girl, and vanish into a network of back roads that the Seraphs didn't know existed. Jack stood at the opening in the fence, the cold wind cutting through his jacket, the taillights already gone, swallowed by the forest. He held the sneaker against his chest and felt something crack inside him. Not rage this time, not the familiar heat that lived in his basement. Something colder. The specific annihilating grief of arriving too late, of opening the closet door and finding it empty. Bear caught up with him, stood beside him, looked at the tire tracks, said nothing for 10 seconds that felt like a year. "We lost her," Jack said. "We haven't lost her." "She's gone, Bear. He had this planned. He had—" "Listen." Bear grabbed Jax's arm, not gently. "Listen." Jax listened. In the distance, from the direction of the service road, the sound of engines. Not one engine, 20. The heavy, unmistakable thunder of Harley-Davidson Vi twins being kicked to life in sequence, one after another, like a chain of detonations rolling through the night. Reno's team. The radio couldn't reach them, but the sound did. And in that sound, Jax heard something that pulled him back from the edge of the abyss he'd been standing on. The recognition that he wasn't alone in this. That 20 men on machines built for highways and hell were between Marcus Vale and whatever vanishing point he was running toward. Then Merritt's convoy arrived. It came without sirens. 4 black SUVs and a tactical van rolling through the main gate with the quiet authority of federal power that doesn't need to announce itself. Agents in dark jackets and body armor spilled out, flashlight beams cutting the darkness like searchlights. Merritt emerged from the lead vehicle, her face rigid, a radio in her hand, already barking coordinates. She found Bear and Jax at the eastern fence. "He ran," she said. Not a question. "East, service road, 5 minutes ago. My men are in pursuit." Merritt's jaw tightened. She turned to an agent beside her and spoke in clipped, coded language that Jax didn't follow. The agent sprinted back to the tactical van. Within 30 seconds, Jax heard the sound of a helicopter spooling up from somewhere beyond the tree line, a federal asset that Merritt had apparently positioned as backup. "We'll find him," Merritt said. Then she looked at Jax, looked at the sneaker he was holding. Something shifted in her expression, something that cracked the professional mask just enough to show the human underneath. "What's that?" "Hers," Jax said. Merritt didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the house, her agents following, their flashlight beams sweeping the property like the compound eyes of some enormous nocturnal predator. Jax stood at the fence. Bear stood beside him. The helicopter was in the air now, its searchlight a white column that swept across the forest canopy, turning the trees into a shifting maze of light and shadow. From the east, the sound of Harley engines still running, still in pursuit, the thunder rolling through the night like a heartbeat that refused to stop. "Come inside," Bear said. "I can't." "Jax, come inside." He followed Bear back through the cut fence, across the frozen lawn, and into the house that had been Lily's prison for 3 years. Federal agents were moving through the rooms now, opening doors, photographing walls, cataloging evidence with the methodical precision of people who do this often enough to have developed a routine. Jax walked upstairs. Nobody stopped him. He found the room he'd seen through the window. 2nd floor, end of the hall. The door was open. He stepped inside and the air left his lungs. It was worse than Bear. It was engineered. The bed was a single mattress on a metal frame, bolted to the floor. The desk was a slab of laminate attached to the wall, no drawers, nothing that could be moved or hidden or personalized. The window had no curtains. The walls were white. Not painted white, original drywall, never decorated, never touched. No posters, no stickers, no drawings, no books. Nothing that indicated a child had lived here except the small indentation in the mattress where a body too light to leave a real impression had slept every night for 1,000 nights. On the wall beside the bed, at a height of about 3 feet, something that stopped Jax's heart. Scratches. Tiny, precise scratches in the drywall, made with a fingernail or a small, sharp object. Rows of them. Hundreds. Organized into groups of 5, 4 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal. The universal language of captivity. The tally marks of someone counting days. Jax touched the wall, ran his fingers over the scratches. Felt the ridges of each mark against his skin. 847. He counted them twice to be sure. 847 days. 2 years, 3 months, and 22 days of a child's life, recorded in the only medium available to her, the destruction of the wall that held her. His hand was shaking. His whole arm was shaking. He pressed his palm flat against the scratches and closed his eyes and felt the room close around him like a fist. And for a moment he was 9 years old again, pressed against a closet door counting hours, waiting for someone to come. Someone was behind him, he knew without turning. The weight of the presence, the smell of leather and coffee and engine oil. Bear. Federal found something, Bear said. His voice was different. Stripped of command, stripped of authority. What was left sounded like a man who had walked into a wound he wasn't prepared for. Downstairs. In the basement. You need to see it. Jax followed him down. Through the kitchen. Through a door he hadn't noticed behind a pantry shelf that swung open on concealed hinges. Down a set of concrete stairs into a basement that smelled like electronics and recycled air and something else. The sweet, stale scent of a space that had been occupied and sealed and occupied again. Federal agents were already down there, their flashlights illuminating a room that made the bedroom look humane. Monitors. 12 of them, mounted in 3 rows of 4 on a purpose-built wall rack. All dark now, but the labels underneath each screen told the story. Bedroom, bathroom, hallway, kitchen, backyard, schoolroom, each label handwritten in precise block letters. Below the monitors, a console of equipment, recording devices, signal processors, audio amplifiers. A pair of headphones hung from a hook. On the desk, a logbook, leather-bound, heavy, filled with handwriting that was almost calligraphic in its precision. Merritt was holding the logbook open. She looked up when Jax entered. Her face was the color of concrete. He logged everything, she said. Every movement, every sound, time-stamped, dated, cross-referenced. 3 years of surveillance on a 7-year-old child documented like a scientific experiment. She turned the book so Jax could see. The entries were meticulous. 7:14. Subject woke. Remained in bed for 4 minutes before standing. Heart rate elevated. Possible nightmare. Crying duration. 2 minutes, 17 seconds. Page after page. Thousands of entries. Every cough. Every sob. Every whispered word a child had said to herself in the dark, thinking no one was listening. Jax looked at the headphones on the hook, the ones Marcus Vale had used to listen to a child cry herself to sleep every night for 3 years. He turned and walked up the stairs, through the kitchen, through the mudroom, out the back door, across the frozen lawn. He made it to the fence line before his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees in the frozen grass and pressed his forehead against the cold steel of the fence and opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Not a sound, not a breath. Just a silence so total and so deep that it felt like the earth had swallowed him. Bear found him there, sat down beside him in the frozen grass, didn't speak, didn't touch him, just sat. Minutes passed. The helicopter swept overhead, its searchlight painting the forest in strobes of white. Radios crackled from inside the house. The sound of Harley engines pulsed in the distance. Closer now, circling, the pack tightening its formation around something Jax couldn't see. Bear! His voice was a ruin. If he gets away, he won't. If he takes her somewhere we can't, he won't. Listen. Jax listened. The engines. They weren't just circling, they were converging. The sound was collapsing inward, 20 distinct exhaust notes merging into a single roar that grew louder, closer, more concentrated. Renault's team was driving something toward them, herding it, the way wolves drive prey toward the rest of the pack. Then a new sound, tires on gravel, moving fast, coming from the service road. Headlights appeared through the trees. A single vehicle, weaving, its engine whining in the high register of panic. Behind it, a wall of headlights. 20 Harleys in tight formation, their high beams blazing, boxing the vehicle into a corridor of light that narrowed with every second. The vehicle burst through the tree line and onto the back lawn. A black sedan, not the Mercedes, something smaller, a second car that had been hidden on the service road. It skidded on the frozen grass, fishtailed, and came to a stop 30 feet from where Jax and Bear were kneeling. The driver's door opened. Marcus Vale stepped out. He looked exactly as Jax remembered from the diner. The blazer, the turtleneck, the styled hair. But something had come unmoored. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold. His eyes moved in quick reptilian sweeps across the property. The federal vehicles, the agents, the bikes, the men. calculating. Even now, even with everything collapsing, the machine behind his eyes was running numbers. "I want my lawyer," he said. His voice was steady, practiced. "I want my lawyer, and I want to know on what authority—" "Where's the girl?" Jack said. He was standing now. He didn't remember standing. His body had moved without consulting his mind, the way it did in combat, the way it did in the moments when the distance between thought and action collapsed to nothing. "I don't know what you're—" "Where is she?" Marcus looked at him, really looked, and Jack saw something in those eyes that sent ice water through his veins. Not fear, not guilt, but annoyance. The cold irritation of a man whose carefully managed system had been disrupted by an inconvenience. "She's my ward," Marcus said. "She's in my care. And you are trespassing on my Merritt stepped between them. Badge out. Voice flat. "Marcus Vale. Federal warrant for your arrest. Charges include fraud, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy to exploit a minor, and—" She paused, glanced at the agents emerging from the basement with evidence bags. "We'll be adding to the list." Federal agents moved toward Vale, and then, only then, did Jack see what he'd been too focused on Vale's face to notice. The back door of the sedan was closed. Jax walked toward the car. Merritt called after him. Bear called after him. He didn't hear them. The world had narrowed to a single point, a car door, a dark interior, and the possibility that behind that door was either a child or an empty seat that meant she was somewhere else, somewhere worse, somewhere he would never find her. He reached the door. His hand closed around the handle, cold metal against his palm. He opened it. Lily was curled on the back seat in a ball so tight she looked boneless. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins, her face buried in the space between her legs. She was wearing one sneaker. The left foot was bare. She was shaking. Not the shaking of cold, but the full-body tremor of a nervous system that had been overwhelmed and was running on pure survival reflex. She didn't look up when the door opened, didn't uncurl, didn't make a sound. She had retreated to the place inside herself where the world couldn't reach. The same place Jax had built in a closet at 9 years old, the interior room where you go when the outside becomes unsurvivable. Jax crouched beside the open door. The frozen grass bit into his knees. He was eye level with the back seat, close enough to see the rapid flutter of her breathing against her folded arms. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch her, didn't tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't okay. None of this was okay. And she was smart enough, had been forced to be smart enough by 3 years of surveillance and control to know the difference between a comforting lie and the truth. Instead, he set the sneaker down on the seat beside her, the left one, the one he'd been carrying since he found it on the hallway floor. "I found your shoe," he said. That was all. A long time passed, 30 seconds, a minute. Behind him, the noise of the operation continued. Agents, radios, the helicopter, the growl of idling Harleys. But in the space between Jax and the open car door, there was a silence that belonged to no one else. A silence that was waiting to be filled by a choice that only a 7-year-old girl could make. Lily's head lifted. Slowly. The way a deer raises its head after a gunshot. Not from curiosity, but from the need to assess whether the danger has passed or simply changed shape. Her gray eyes found his. She looked at the sneaker, then at him, then at the sneaker again. Her hand uncurled from around her shin. Small fingers, shaking, reached for the shoe. She pulled it into her lap and held it against her chest like a stuffed animal, like the only object in the world that had been returned to her instead of taken away. "There are men outside," Jack said quietly. "A lot of them. They rode here tonight because they know about the tracker and the cameras and the room with the scratches on the wall. They know about all of it. And they're not leaving until you're safe." Lily stared at him. Her lips were cracked. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt. She looked like a child who had lived underground for 1,000 days and was seeing light for the first time and couldn't yet tell whether it was salvation or another trap. "Are you one of them?" she whispered. Jax looked at his own hands, scarred, broken. The hands of a man who had failed more people than he'd saved and who carried the weight of every failure in the permanent ache of his knuckles. The hands of a man who had been locked in a closet at 9 and had spent 35 years trying to break out. "Yeah," he said. "I'm one of them." Lily uncurled, slowly, painfully, like a body learning to take a shape it had forgotten was possible. She slid across the seat toward the open door, still clutching the sneaker, her bare foot hanging over the edge. She looked at the ground, frozen grass, dark sky, a world that was louder and colder and more terrifying than the cage she'd known. She looked at Jax. She reached out her hand, and at that moment, standing in the arc lights of a federal operation, surrounded by agents and evidence and the wreckage of Marcus Vale's meticulous empire, Jax Mercer took a 7-year-old girl's hand and understood with absolute bone-deep clarity that the door he had been waiting 35 years for someone to open was a door he had to open himself, not by being rescued, but by becoming the rescue. Behind them, Marcus Vale was on his knees in the frozen grass, federal agents cuffing his wrists, his mouth still moving, still calculating, still performing the role of a man who believed that control was the same thing as power. But nobody was listening to him anymore. Because Lily was standing now, both sneakers on, Jax's hand steady around hers, and 175 men in leather and denim and engine grease were watching from the tree line, silent and still, and every single one of them was crying, and not one of them would ever admit it, and not one of them needed to. Then Merritt's radio crackled. Her face changed. She pressed the earpiece deeper and turned away. When she turned back, she was looking at Bear with an expression that Jax had seen on intelligence officers in combat, the expression of someone who has just received information that changes the operational landscape so completely that every assumption made before that moment is now useless. "The basement logs," Merritt said. "My team finished the preliminary scan. Vale didn't just document Lily." She paused, the kind of pause that rewrites the air. "There are entries for 11 other children, names, locations, monitoring protocols, the entire network, every child, every guardian, every estate. He kept records of all of them." She swallowed. "And 3 of those children are listed as terminated assets. Accounts closed. No corresponding death certificates on file." The forest went silent. Even the helicopter seemed to hold its breath. 3 children. Not missing, not relocated, terminated. The word hung in the frozen air like a thing with weight and edges, and every man who heard it felt something shift inside them. The understanding that what they had walked into tonight was not a custody dispute, not a financial crime, not even a single man's obsession. It was a machine, a system designed to consume children and convert them into money and dispose of the ones who stopped being profitable. Bear looked at Jax. Jax looked at Lily. Lily looked up at both of them with eyes that were too old for her face and too tired for her age, and that held, beneath all the damage, a flicker of something that Jax recognized because he had spent his entire life searching for it in himself. Not hope. Not yet. Something before hope. The first tentative crack in a wall that had been sealed for so long, the person behind it had forgotten there was an outside. And Jax understood. Standing in the frozen dark with a child's hand in his and 175 brothers at his back and a horror larger than any of them had imagined unfolding around them, that this night was not ending. It was just beginning. The next 6 hours happened in a language that only exhaustion speaks fluently. Merritt commandeered the estate's dining room as a field command post. The table that Marcus Vale had eaten his measured, controlled meals at, the same table where Lily had never been allowed to choose her own food, was now buried under laptops, evidence bags, satellite phones, and topographic maps marked with red circles. 11 red circles. 11 addresses. 11 children who were, at this very moment, sleeping in rooms monitored by cameras and locked by systems designed by a man now sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle with his wrists cuffed to a bolt in the floor. Jax hadn't let go of Lily's hand. Not when the paramedics arrived and wrapped a shock blanket around her shoulders. Not when a female federal agent crouched in front of her and asked questions in a voice so carefully modulated it sounded rehearsed. Not when Bear brought coffee that Jax accepted with his free hand and drank standing, the tin mug burning his palm, the caffeine hitting a system that was already running on fumes and adrenaline and something older than both. Lily held on too. Her grip was constant, not tight, not panicked, just present. The grip of someone who had found a fixed point in a world that had been spinning for 3 years and was not willing to risk losing it by letting go. At 0300, Merritt pulled Jax aside, or tried to. Lily came with him, her bare feet. She'd refused to put the sneakers back on, clutching them against her chest instead, leaving small prints on the hardwood floor. "We have a problem," Merritt said. Jax looked at her. The professional mask had cracked further in the hours since the arrest. Underneath was a woman running on caffeine and fury and the particular brand of moral exhaustion that comes from fighting a system designed to protect the people you're trying to stop. Her eyes were bloodshot. A vein pulsed at her temple. "The 3 terminated entries in Vale's log," she said. "We've identified 2 of them. Children who were reported as runaways by their guardians. Cases went cold. Local law enforcement filed the paperwork and moved on. But the 3rd entry..." She paused, looked at Lily, looked back at Jax. "The 3rd entry is different. It's not a child." Jax felt the temperature in the room change. "It's Catherine Marrow," Merritt said. "Lily's mother. Vale logged her the same way he logged the children. Movement, biometric data, audio surveillance. The monitoring started 18 months before her death. And the final entry..." Merritt pulled out a tablet, scrolled to a photograph of the logbook page. "The final entry reads, asset neutralized, estate transferred, daughter secured. Dated the same day as Catherine's death." The words landed like a detonation in a sealed room. No shrapnel, no fire. Just the total, instantaneous compression of everything you thought you knew into a space too small to hold it. Vale hadn't just exploited Lily. He had eliminated her mother to get to her. Jax looked down at Lily. She was staring at the floor, her fingers curled around the sneakers, her body perfectly still in that trained, terrible stillness he'd recognized the first night in the diner. She had heard. Children always heard. They heard everything the adults thought they were hiding, and they stored it in rooms inside themselves where it grew teeth and claws in the dark. "Not here," Jax said to Merritt. His voice was a blade. "Not in front of her." Merritt nodded, stepped back, but the damage was done. The information was in the air, and it would settle into Lily's bones the way all devastating truths settle into the bones of children who have already learned that the world is not safe. Bear appeared in the doorway. His face was granite. He'd been outside with the men, 175 riders who had been standing in the cold for 4 hours, waiting, watching, their breath-making clouds in the frozen air, their bodies running on nothing but coffee and conviction. They hadn't been told about the 11 children or the terminated assets or Catherine Marrow. They didn't need to be told. They could feel it, the way animals feel a storm before the first drop falls. "We need to talk," Bear said to Jax. Then he looked at Lily. His face changed. The granite softened, just barely, just enough. "Hey, little one. You hungry?" Lily didn't answer, but she looked at Bear and something in her gaze shifted. Not trust. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford yet, but the recognition that this enormous, terrifying man was asking a question she was allowed to answer. She nodded. Once, Bear called over a prospect, a 20-year-old kid named Webb who had joined the Seraph 6 months ago and whose primary qualification was that he was the least threatening human being Jax had ever met. Soft face, gentle voice, the kind of kid who'd joined a biker club because he needed a family, not because he needed to be dangerous. "Webb, find this young lady some food, whatever she wants, and sit with her until I come back." Webb crouched to Lily's eye level. "Hi, I'm Webb. What do you like to eat?" Lily looked at Jax. The question in her eyes was clear. Is it safe to let go? Jax knelt, put his face level with hers. "I'll be right in the other room. You can see me through the door. I'm not leaving." A long moment. Then Lily's fingers uncurled from his hand, one by one, like a fist learning to open after being clenched for 1,000 days. She went with Webb. Jax watched her walk away, small, barefoot, wrapped in a shock blanket, holding 2 sneakers in the hand of a stranger, and felt something rearrange itself in his chest. Not breaking, rebuilding. The architecture of a heart that had been configured for isolation being forced by the weight of a child's trust to accommodate something it had spent 35 years refusing to hold. Bear led him outside. The cold hit like a wall. 2 in the morning in late autumn, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill, it excavates. strips away everything superficial until only the essential remains. The compound was arranged around them like a siege camp, bikes in rows, men in clusters, some standing, some sitting on the frozen ground with their backs against wheels, all of them awake, all of them silent. Smoke from a few cigarettes drifted upward. The helicopter had moved to a wider search pattern, its searchlight now a distant sweep against the clouds. Bear walked past them toward the tree line. Jax followed. When they were out of earshot, Bear stopped. Merritt just got off the phone with her director, Bear said. The 11 children. They're initiating simultaneous raids across 6 states, federal marshals, coordinated takedowns, the whole machine. Good. Not good. Listen. Bear rubbed his face with both hands. The sound of callous skin against beard stubble was like sandpaper on stone. 3 of those locations are within 200 miles of here. Merritt's team is stretched thin. She's got 16 agents on site. The coordinated raids start at 0600. That's 3 hours. She needs bodies for the 3 closest locations. Jax understood. She's asking us. She's asking me, and I'm asking you, because this started with you and it ends with you. You know my answer. I know your answer, but I need you to hear what I'm about to say first. Bear turned to face him fully. In the dark, his silhouette was a mountain with eyes. These 3 locations aren't like Vale's estate. One of them is a gated community with private security, one is a ranch property in the next county, and one, Bear paused. One is the personal residence of Sheriff Dean Purcell. The ground shifted under Jax's feet, not physically. Something deeper. The recognition that the corruption they'd uncovered wasn't a branch, it was a root system, and it ran under everything. Purcell has one of the children? Purcell's wife died 4 years ago. 6 months later, he was appointed guardian of a 9-year-old boy named Elias through a private arrangement brokered by Marcus Vale's law firm. Same pattern, deceased parent, substantial estate, guardian with total control. Bear's voice was barely audible now, swallowed by the cold and the dark and the weight of what he was saying. That boy has been in Purcell's house for 3.5 years, and nobody, not the county, not the courts, not a single person in the system that is supposed to protect children, has ever checked on him. Jax closed his eyes. Behind the lids, the image of tally marks on a white wall. 847 days. How long for Elias? He asked. Over 1,200 days? The number sat between them like a live thing. 1,200 days, 3 years and change, a child growing up inside a system designed to erase him. I'll go, Jax said. You'll go to Purcell's? I'll go to Purcell's. Bear nodded slowly. I'm sending Cade with you, and 30 riders. Merritt will have federal backup en route, but they may not arrive until after 0600. For the window between when you get there and when federal shows up, you'll be on your own. 30 bikers on a county sheriff's front lawn. Purcell will call his deputies. Probably. Armed deputies. Probably. And we go clean. No weapons. Same rules. No weapons. No violence. Presence only. You stand there and you don't move, and you make it impossible for him to pretend the world isn't watching. Jax looked back at the estate. Through the dining room window, he could see Lily sitting at the table with Webb. She was eating something. A sandwich, it looked like, with the careful, mechanical precision of a child who had been trained to consume food as a function rather than a pleasure. Webb was sitting across from her, talking quietly, his body language open and unthreatening. What about her? She stays here. Merritt's people will process her. There's a social worker coming from the state, and Bear hesitated. That hesitation was the heaviest thing Jax had ever heard from the man. Jax, when this is over, when the raids are done and the children are out and the federal machine takes over, we need to talk about what happens next for her. I know. Do you? Because what you're feeling right now, what you've been feeling since you walked into that diner, it's real and it matters, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. But you're a 44-year-old drifter with no fixed address, a PTSD diagnosis, and a history of alcohol abuse. The courts aren't going to hand you a child. The words should have hurt. They didn't. They were just true. The way gravity is true, and winter is true, and the fact that damage doesn't disappear just because you've learned to carry it. I know, Jack said again, but I'm going to be there, however they'll let me. I'm going to be there. Bear put his hand on Jack's shoulder, squeezed once. The grip of a man who understood that some promises are made not because you know you can keep them, but because not making them would be a kind of death. Go tell her, Bear said. Jax walked back inside, crossed the room, sat down across from Lily, in the chair where Marcus Vale used to sit. The chair felt wrong, too comfortable, engineered for a man who had designed every surface of this house to serve his own control. Lily looked at him over the remains of a peanut butter sandwich. Her gray eyes tracked his face with the precision of a surveillance camera, but warmer now, the mechanical quality softened into something that was almost curiosity. I have to go somewhere tonight, Jack said. There's a boy. He's in a house like this one, with a person like Marcus, and he's been there even longer than you. Lily absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, silently, completely, without the visible emotional response that adults expected from children. She processed data. She calculated threat levels. She assessed the information for its impact on her own survival. Jax recognized the pattern because it was his pattern, the hypervigilant architecture of a mind that had been forced to grow up in a war zone. Are you coming back? She asked. Yes. How do I know? The question stripped him bare, not because it was aggressive or accusatory, but because it was the most rational question a 7-year-old prisoner could ask. How do I know? Prove it. Because every adult in her life had either failed her, exploited her, or died. And trust was not a feeling. It was evidence. Jax pulled the sneaker from where he'd set it beside his chair, the left one, the one he'd carried across a frozen lawn. He set it on the table between them. I carried your shoe because I wasn't going to leave without giving it back. That's who I am. I return things. He held her gaze. I'll come back. Same as the shoe. A long silence. Then Lily reached across the table and pushed the sneaker toward him. Keep it, she said. So you have to come back. Jax picked it up, tucked it inside his jacket, against his chest, where the leather was warm from his body. He felt the weight of it against his ribs. Almost nothing, barely a few ounces, but heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He stood, walked to the door, turned back once. Lily was watching him with those gray eyes, and in them he saw something that hadn't been there 6 hours ago. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. A crack in the wall, a door unlocked but not yet opened. He nodded to her. She nodded back. The same slow, deliberate nod that the Seraphs used when language was insufficient. Then he walked into the cold and the dark, and the war that was just beginning. 30 bikes. No headlights. The same formation they'd used to approach Vale's estate, but faster now, engines running, the thunder of V-twins echoing off the trees as they tore down logging roads toward the county seat. Cade rode beside Jax, his burn-scarred arm visible below his rolled sleeve despite the cold, his face set in an expression of calculated fury. They'd been briefed. Purcell's residence was a 5-bedroom colonial on 2 acres at the edge of town. Gated, but not fortified. The sheriff hadn't invested in Vale's level of security because the sheriff was the security. No one investigated the investigator. No one surveilled the man with the badge. Teller had pulled the property layout from county records. Single access road. Detached garage. The boys' room, if the pattern held, would be on the 2nd floor, isolated from the main living areas, likely monitored the same way Lily's had been. They arrived at 0417. The town was asleep. Streetlights cast orange pools on empty sidewalks. A gas station sign glowed in the distance. The only movement was a stray dog trotting across a parking lot with something in its mouth. Purcell's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with bare oak trees. The gate was wrought iron, decorative, unlocked. The driveway was smooth asphalt. The house was dark except for a single light on the ground floor, the blue flicker of a television screen behind drawn curtains. Jax raised his hand. 30 engines died simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute. They dismounted, walked their bikes the final 100 yards, parked in a semicircle that blocked the driveway completely. Then they stood. 30 men in leather and denim, their breath-making clouds in the streetlight, their faces set in expressions that ranged from stone to storm. Jax walked to the front door. Cade flanked him. The porch was immaculate, swept, painted, with a welcome mat that said "Home Sweet Home" in cheerful script. The irony was so violent it felt like a physical blow. Jax knocked. Not pounded. Knocked. 3 times. Firm, measured, the knock of a man who is not going away. 30 seconds. A minute. The television light shifted behind the curtains. Footsteps. Heavy. The measured tread of a man accustomed to being the authority in any room he entered. The door opened. Sheriff Dean Purcell was shorter than Jax expected. 5'10", maybe 5'11", with the thick build of a man who'd been powerful in his youth and was now softening into something that would eventually become frailty, but for now was just mass. Silver hair cropped close, small eyes set deep under heavy brows. He was wearing a flannel shirt untucked over jeans, and his right hand was behind the doorframe in a way that told Jax exactly where his sidearm was. Purcell looked at Jax, looked past him at the 30 men in his cul-de-sac. His expression didn't change. Not surprise, not fear, just the cold assessment of a man who had spent a career calculating angles. "Do you know who I am?" Purcell said. "Yes." "Then you know this is a mistake." "We know about Elias," Jax said. The name landed like a bullet in a bulletproof vest, absorbed but not without impact. Something moved behind Purcell's eyes. A recalculation. The recognition that the equation had changed. "I don't know what you think you—" Marcus Vale is in federal custody. His records are in federal hands. Every child, every guardian, every dollar, every entry in every logbook. Jax paused. Let it settle. "We know about Elias, and in approximately 90 minutes, federal marshals are going to be standing where I'm standing. The only question is what they find when they get here." Purcell's hand tightened on whatever was behind the doorframe. His jaw worked. The small eyes went flat, the look of an animal deciding between fight and flight. "You have no authority here," Purcell said. "You're a biker, a criminal, a nobody on my porch at 4 a.m. I could arrest every one of you right now." "You could try," Cade said from Jax's left. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. The voice of a man who had survived an IED and discovered that there was very little in the civilian world that could make him flinch. "But you'd have to call your deputies, and your deputies would have to drive past 30 motorcycles blocking your driveway. And by the time they sorted that out, federal would be here. And then everyone, your deputies, your neighbors, the county, the state, everyone would know why federal marshals executed a warrant on the county sheriff's house at dawn." He paused. "Or you could let us see the boy, right now. And this stays between us until the marshals arrive." Purcell's gaze moved between them, calculating, always calculating. Men like Purcell never stopped running numbers, never stopped looking for the angle that would let them maintain control. But the numbers weren't working anymore. The variables had changed. The system he'd operated within, the network of compliant judges and silent social workers and buried reports, had been exposed, and no amount of calculation could put it back together. "I want my lawyer," Purcell said. "You'll get your lawyer after we see the boy." A long, terrible silence. Purcell's hand moved from behind the doorframe. Empty. No weapon. Not because he'd chosen peace, but because he'd calculated that violence would accelerate his destruction. He stepped aside. Jax entered the house. It smelled like microwave dinners and gun oil and the stale air of a home where no windows had been opened in months. The living room was cluttered. Newspapers, empty glasses, a recliner positioned in front of a massive television. The kitchen was visible through a doorway, dishes piled in the sink. The stairs were to the right. Jax took them. Behind him, Cade stayed with Purcell. The sound of Jax's boots on the wooden steps was the only noise in the house. Each footfall deliberate, controlled, the measured ascent of a man walking towards something he was terrified to find. Second floor. Hallway. 3 doors. 2 open. A bathroom. A master bedroom with an unmade bed. 1 closed. At the end of the hall, with a deadbolt mounted on the outside. A deadbolt on the outside of a bedroom door. Jax's hand closed around the bolt. Cold metal. He turned it. The mechanism slid with a sound that was too small for the weight it carried. The click of a lock that had kept a 9-year-old boy inside a room for 1,200 days. He opened the door. The room was dark, darker than the rest of the house because the window had been covered. Not with curtains, but with plywood, screwed into the frame from the outside. No light in, no light out. A bed, a bucket. A bare bulb overhead that was controlled by a switch in the hallway, not inside the room. On the bed, a shape, small, curled, the same defensive posture Jax had seen in the back seat of Vale's sedan, the same contracted, minimized form of a child who had learned to occupy as little space as possible. "Elias," Jax said. His voice cracked on the second syllable. The shape didn't move. Jax stepped into the room. The floor was bare concrete. The carpet had been removed or had never been installed. His boots made no sound. He crouched beside the bed the way he'd crouched beside Vale's car and waited. Minutes. The room smelled like unwashed sheets and dust and the particular devastating scent of a space where a child had lived without dignity. Jax breathed through it, held his position, let the boy decide. Elias uncurled, slowly. A face emerged from behind thin arms, dark skin, dark eyes, a shaved head with hair just beginning to grow back in uneven patches. He was smaller than Jax expected, malnourished, the kind of thin that doesn't come from missing a meal, but from months of calculated deprivation. "Who are you?" the boy whispered. "My name's Jax. I'm here to take you out of this room." "He'll hear you. He always hears." "He can't do anything about it. Not anymore." Elias looked at the door, open, the hallway beyond it visible. The deadbolt disengaged. His eyes widened, not with hope, but with the stunned incomprehension of a prisoner confronted with an unlocked door for the first time. "I'm not supposed to leave the room," he said. The words were quiet and matter-of-fact, and they hit Jax with the force of a freight train. Not supposed to leave the room. 3.5 years of conditioning distilled into 6 words. A child who had been programmed to enforce his own imprisonment even when the lock was open. "The rules changed tonight," Jax said. "New rules. You can leave the room. You can go downstairs. You can walk outside. You can do whatever you want." "What if he gets mad? He's not in charge anymore." Elias stared at him, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden condition that would snap shut once he moved. Because in his experience, every open door was a test, and every test had a wrong answer, and the wrong answer always led to the dark. Downstairs, the sound of the front door opening. Voices. Multiple. The authoritative cadence of federal agents. Merritt's people, ahead of schedule. Jax extended his hand, the same gesture he'd made to Lily. Palm up, open. An offer, not a command. "Come on," he said. "There are people waiting for you." Elias looked at the hand, then at the door, then at the window, boarded shut, nailed closed, as dark as every night he'd spent behind it. He reached out. His fingers were ice cold. They closed around Jax's palm with a grip that was fragile and fierce simultaneously, the grip of a child who is taking the most terrifying step of his life and has decided, against all evidence, against all experience, against every lesson the world has beaten into him, to trust a stranger with scarred hands and a leather jacket and eyes that held a darkness the boy recognized as his own. Jax lifted him off the bed. The boy weighed nothing, a collection of bones and breath wrapped in a t-shirt 2 sizes too large. Jax carried him down the stairs, past the living room where Purcell was now surrounded by federal agents, past the kitchen with its stacked dishes, through the front door and onto the porch with the welcome mat that said, "Home Sweet Home." Outside, 30 men stood in a semicircle. The first light of dawn was creeping over the rooftops, turning the sky from black to deep blue to the pale gray that comes before color. The streetlights were still on, casting orange halos that mixed with the emerging daylight to create a strange liminal glow. Not night, not morning, but the threshold between. Elias blinked in the light, pressed his face against Jax's shoulder, then lifted his head and looked at the men, the bikes, the leather. The faces that were scarred and tired and wet with something none of them would name. "Are they all here for me?" Elias whispered. Jax couldn't speak. His throat had closed, his eyes burned, the sneaker inside his jacket pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Cade answered for him, standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his burn-scarred arm at his side, his glasses reflecting the dawn. "Yeah, kid, every single one." A sound came from the men. Not a cheer, not a shout. Something lower, deeper, a collective exhale. The release of a tension that had been building for hours, for days, for the accumulated lifetimes of damage that every man in that semicircle carried. Some of them turned away. Some covered their mouths with their hands. One man, a bearded giant named Hollis, who had once ridden from Oregon to Georgia without stopping, sat down on the curb and put his head in his hands and shook. And across the county, at that exact moment, the coordinated raids hit. Teller's updates came through the repaired comms in fragments. Location 2. Child recovered, guardian in custody. Location 3. Child recovered, guardian fled on foot, federal pursuing. And from an estate 200 miles north, the longest update, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah, who had been locked in a basement for 4 years, walked into daylight holding the hand of a U.S. Marshal and asked if she was allowed to look at the sky. Jack stood on Purcell's porch, holding a boy he'd known for 3 minutes and would carry for the rest of his life, and listened to the network collapse. One node at a time, one child at a time, one locked door at a time. The machine that Marcus Vail had built, the system of guardians and judges and silent sheriffs and monitored children and terminated assets, was being dismantled by men with badges and men with patches and the terrible, unstoppable momentum of a truth that had finally reached the surface. But it wasn't over. His phone buzzed. Bear's number. He answered with Elias still pressed against his shoulder. "Jax!" Bear's voice was wrong, stripped, the voice of a man delivering news that has physically wounded him. "Get back here. Now." What happened? Merritt's team finished processing Vail's basement, the logbook, the equipment, all of it. A breath, heavy, ragged. They found a safe, behind the wall, hidden behind the monitoring station. What was in it? A pause so long Jax could hear Bear's heartbeat through the phone. Documentation, legal filings, custody petitions, prepared in advance for 12 more children, 12 new targets, with names, addresses, family court schedules, financial projections. Bear's voice dropped to a whisper. He wasn't just running a network, Jax. He was scaling it. And the legal firm that prepared the documents, they're not some back alley operation. It's one of the largest family law practices in the state. 40 attorneys, exposed, connected to judges in every jurisdiction we've touched tonight. The dawn light was turning gold now, catching the chrome of 30 Harleys and the badge on a federal agent's belt, and the tears on the face of a man named Hollis, sitting on a curb in a cul-de-sac in a small town that had been keeping secrets for years. "There's something else," Bear said, and the way he said it, the fracture in his voice, the pause before and after, the quality of breath that accompanies words a person doesn't want to release, told Jax that whatever came next was the thing that would change everything. The 12 new targets, the children in those files. Bear paused one final time. 3 of them are already in guardian placement. The petitions were filed and approved, through Purcell's court, under seal, in the last 90 days. 3 more children, already placed, already inside the machine, already behind locked doors and boarded windows and deadbolts on the outside, and trackers on their ankles and adults who called them assets and counted their steps and logged their tears. Jax looked at the boy in his arms, looked at the dawn, looked at the 30 men who had ridden through the night to stand on a stranger's lawn because a child they'd never met deserved to see the morning. "How fast can you get me the addresses?" Jax said. "Teller's working on it. 20 minutes. "Tell him he has 10. Jax handed Elias to a waiting paramedic. The boy's fingers clung to his jacket for a moment, those ice-cold, fragile, fierce fingers, before releasing. Jax crouched, eye level. "I'll come back," he said. "New rules, remember?" Elias nodded. That same slow nod. The language of men who have seen the dark and chosen to walk toward the light anyway. Jack stood, walked to his bike, kicked the Road King to life. The engine roared in the quiet dawn street like a declaration of war. Cade appeared beside him, already on his bike, already running. "How many?" Cade asked. "3. "How far?" "Don't know yet." Cade looked at the road ahead, the gold light catching his glasses, the burn scars on his arm glowing in the dawn. "Then we ride until we know." Behind them, 30 engines fired, one after another. The chain of detonations rolling through the cul-de-sac like thunder from a storm that had finally decided to commit. Neighbors' lights flickered on. Curtains pulled back. Faces appeared in windows, confused, frightened, curious, watching a column of motorcycles pull out of their street with the focused urgency of men who had somewhere to be and would not be stopped by anything short of the earth itself opening beneath their wheels. Jax's phone buzzed against his thigh. A text from Teller. 3 addresses. 3 towns. The furthest was 140 miles northeast. He twisted the throttle. The Road King surged forward. The cold air hit his face like a fist, and he leaned into it. The sneaker pressed against his ribs, the engine screaming beneath him, the road unrolling into a dawn that was still deciding whether it would be kind or cruel. Behind him, 30 riders followed. And behind them, across 6 states, the network was burning, and children were walking out of rooms they'd been told they could never leave, and the machine was breaking, and the men who built it were learning what it felt like to have someone count their steps. But 3 more children were still inside, 3 more locked doors, 3 more deadbolts, 3 more boarded windows. And the sun was rising, and time was the one enemy that no amount of brotherhood could defeat. And somewhere ahead on a road Jax hadn't ridden before, 3 children were waking up inside a nightmare that didn't know it was about to end. The first child was in a townhouse 14 miles east. They reached it at 0509. The sky was the color of a bruise healing, purple fading to gray fading to the thin, reluctant gold of a dawn that seemed unsure whether it wanted to arrive. Jax's hands were numb on the handlebars. His bad knee had locked somewhere around mile 8, and every gear shift sent a current of pain from his ankle to his hip that he processed and discarded the way he'd been processing and discarding pain his entire life. As information, not permission to stop. The townhouse was in a subdivision that had been built during the last housing boom and abandoned halfway through the recession. Half the units were occupied. The other half stared out at the street with blank windows and foreclosure signs and lawns that had given up. Unit 14C had a light on. A woman answered the door, mid-40s, thin, with the brittle posture of someone holding herself together with tension alone. She saw the bikes, saw the leather, saw Jax and Cade on her porch, and her face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, fear, and then something Jax hadn't expected: relief. The pure collapsing relief of a person whose secret has finally been discovered by someone other than the person enforcing it. "You're here for Oliver," she said. Not a question. The boy was 6. He was sitting on a kitchen floor playing with a set of measuring spoons because there were no toys in the house. The tracker on his ankle was identical to Lily's, but slim, black, blinking green. The woman, a cousin of Oliver's deceased father, appointed guardian through Vale's network, stood in the doorway and watched federal agents remove the device, and she didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't move. She simply stood there like a building whose foundation had been pulled out, waiting to fall. Cade stayed with the federal team. Jax took 20 riders to the second address, a farmhouse 47 miles north, where a 10-year-old girl named Priya had been kept in an attic room for 2 years by a man who called himself her uncle and had no biological relation to her. The man wasn't home when they arrived. The girl was alone in the attic with a mattress, a water bottle, and a stack of school workbooks that had never been graded because she'd never been enrolled in a school. She came down the stairs blinking in the light like someone emerging from underwater, her hand gripping the banister with both hands, her bare feet testing each step as though the floor might not hold. The third address was the hardest, 140 miles northeast, a lake house on 30 acres of private land, owned by a retired family court judge named Harold Wynn. Jax rode the entire distance at speeds that turned the highway into a tunnel of wind and noise. The Road King's engine running at a pitch that was somewhere between a growl and a scream. 12 riders stayed with him. The rest peeled off to reinforce the other locations as federal teams arrived. They reached the lake house at 7:22. The sun was fully up now, weak and pale through thin clouds, casting a flat light that made everything look like a photograph from a case file. The property was beautiful, the kind of lakeside retreat that appeared in real estate magazines, with a dock and a boathouse and mature trees that would shade the lawn in summer. A place designed for family reunions and childhood summers and the kind of memories that people build lives around. The front door was locked. Nobody answered. Jax walked around this house, his boots leaving prints in the frost-covered grass, and found a back door with a dog flap that had been sealed shut with duct tape from the inside. He looked through a window. Kitchen, empty. Living room beyond it, empty. No furniture had been moved, no bags packed, no sign of flight. But a car was in the garage, engine cold, and the judge's coat was hanging on a hook by the door. They were inside, hiding. Jax knocked on the back door, waited, knocked again. The sound echoed across the still lake water and came back, changed, flattened, as if even the echo was exhausted. The door opened. Judge Harold Wynn was 71 years old. He had the thin, papery look of a man whose authority had always been conferred by a robe and a gavel rather than by physical presence. Wire-rimmed glasses, pressed khakis, a cardigan that probably cost more than Jax's motorcycle. He looked at Jax with the expression of a man who had been expecting this moment for a very long time and had rehearsed his response. "You have no jurisdiction," Wynn said. His voice was steady, almost bored. "You have no warrant. You are trespassing on private property, and anything you find or claim to find will be inadmissible." "Where's the child?" Jax said. "There is no child here. I live alone. Federal marshals are 20 minutes behind me. You can tell them that. But I'm telling you right now, where is the child?" Wynn adjusted his glasses. A gesture of control. The small, mechanical action of a man accustomed to managing situations from behind a bench, where the rules always favored him. "I've been a judge in this state for 34 years. I know the law better than any biker with a patch on his back. You will leave my property, or I will have you arrested." Behind Jax, the 12 riders stood in the driveway, silent, unmoving. The morning light caught the chrome of their bikes and threw it back in splinters. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Their presence was the statement. 12 men who had ridden 140 miles through the night and the dawn to stand on an old man's driveway and refuse to leave. Wynn looked at them, then at Jax. Something shifted in his calculation. The recognition that the rules he'd lived by for 34 years were not the rules that applied on this morning, on this driveway, with these men. "I want to speak with my attorney," Wynn said, "after I see the child." The standoff lasted 11 minutes. Jax counted every one of them. 11 minutes of standing on a back porch in the cold, staring into the eyes of a man who had used the legal system as a weapon for 3 decades, waiting for the architecture of his control to crack. It cracked at minute 11 when the sound of a federal helicopter appeared over the tree line, and Wynn understood with the sudden, devastating clarity of a chess player who has just seen checkmate 12 moves deep that there was no angle left, no appeal, no continuance, no friendly colleague on the bench who could make this go away. He stepped aside. The child was in a room behind the kitchen, a converted pantry, no window, no light switch inside, a sleeping bag on the floor and a plastic cup of water and a pile of clothes that had been washed but never folded. A boy, 8 years old, named Marcus, a coincidence so cruel it felt deliberate. He was sitting against the wall with his arms around his knees, and when the door opened, he didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. He had gone to the place beyond reaction, the place where stimulation and response have been disconnected by repetition, where the body continues to function, but the person inside has retreated to a depth that may or may not be reachable. Jack sat down on the pantry floor. The concrete was cold through his jeans. He didn't reach for the boy, didn't speak. He sat with his back against the opposite wall, 3 feet away, and breathed, slowly, audibly. The rhythm of a body that was choosing to be present in a space where presence was the only thing he could offer. 4 minutes passed. Then the boy's eyes moved. Not his head, just his eyes. They found Jax's boots first, traveled up, the jeans, the leather jacket, the patch. The face of a man who was 44 years old and had been awake for 31 hours and had carried 3 children out of 3 cages in a single night and was sitting on a cold floor in a pantry because a 4th child needed someone to sit with him in the dark before he could believe the door was really open. "Hey," Jax said. The boy's lips moved. No sound. "My name's Jax. There are people outside who are going to help you, but we don't have to go out there yet. We can sit here for a while if you want." A small sound. Not a word. A breath that had something buried in it. A question, maybe, or the beginning of a cry that had been suppressed so many times it no longer knew how to form. "You're safe," Jack said. Not as a promise, not as a reassurance, as a fact. The way you'd say the sun is up or the floor is cold. A statement about the state of the world that didn't require the boy's belief to be true. The boy uncurled. It took 3 minutes. The slowest, most painful unfolding Jax had ever witnessed, each limb extending like a question, each movement testing whether the air would punish it. When he was finally sitting upright, his back against the wall, his legs extended on the concrete, he looked at Jax with eyes that were brown and deep and utterly, completely empty of everything except the raw animal need to be seen. "I'm here," Jax said. The boy reached out, not for Jax's hand, for the edge of his leather jacket. He pinched the leather between his thumb and forefinger and held it, not pulling, just touching, verifying that the material was real, that the man wearing it was solid, that the world had produced something warm. Federal agents entered the house at 7:41. The boy went with a female marshal who had kind eyes and quiet hands. Wynn was arrested on the porch, his wrists cuffed in front of him at his own request, a final, pathetic assertion of dignity, while 12 bikers watched from the driveway and said nothing. It was over. Not dramatically, not with a final confrontation or a climactic showdown. It ended the way these things actually end, with paperwork and paramedics and phone calls and the slow bureaucratic machinery of justice grinding into motion hours after the human cost has already been paid. The network was dismantled, 14 children recovered across 6 states, 4 guardians arrested, 3 more fugitive warrants issued. The law firm that had facilitated the placements was raided at 9 in the morning by federal agents who seized 11 filing cabinets of documents and 3 servers of electronic records. Marcus Vail, in his federal holding cell, said nothing, asked for nothing, stared at the wall with the same flat precision with which he had monitored Lily for 3 years. The machine behind his eyes was still running, but it had nothing left to calculate. Sheriff Purcell attempted to negotiate, offered testimony in exchange for reduced charges, was informed that his testimony was unnecessary because his co-conspirators' records had already provided everything the prosecution needed. He sat in his cell and made calls to attorneys who didn't answer. Judge Wynn requested a private meeting with the U.S. attorney and was denied. He was arraigned the following morning in a courthouse in a different county before a judge who had never played golf with him and was held without bail. And through all of it, while the legal system that had failed 14 children began the slow process of holding itself accountable, 175 men on motorcycles rode home. They came back to the compound in waves, small groups staggering their arrivals as fatigue and distance dictated. Some had ridden 300 miles in 24 hours. Some had stood in this cold for 8 hours without food or rest. They pulled into the gravel lot and killed their engines and sat on their bikes for long moments before dismounting, the way soldiers sit in transports after returning from a mission, letting the stillness register, letting the body understand that the emergency is over, even if the nervous system hasn't gotten the message. Nobody spoke about what they'd seen, not yet. That would come later. In the quiet conversations around the fire pit at midnight, in the long rides that members would take alone in the weeks that followed, in the nightmares that would visit men who thought they'd made peace with their own damage and discovered that the sight of a child's tally marks on a white wall had reopened wounds they'd believed were healed. Jax was the last to return. He rode into the compound at 11 in the morning, 31 hours after he'd left, his body running on nothing. The Road King sputtered as he killed the engine, low on fuel, low on oil, the machine as spent as the man riding it. He sat on the bike for a full minute, his hands still on the grips, his eyes closed, feeling the heat of the engine beneath him fade, the way the heat of adrenaline fades, leaving only the cold truth of exhaustion. Bear was waiting, standing in the doorway of the clubhouse with a mug of coffee, the same way he'd been standing when Jax had arrived days ago with a story about a girl in a diner. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. "She's inside," Bear said. Jax walked past him, through the main hall, past the long oak table where 175 hands had risen in the air, past the bar where Teller's laptop still glowed with data, through a back door into the communal kitchen. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table. Webb was beside her. On the table between them was a box of crayons and a sheet of butcher paper that had been torn from the roll the club used for barbecue preparations. Lily was drawing. Her hand moved with the concentrated precision of a child who had been denied self-expression for 3 years and was rediscovering it the way a starving person rediscovers food. Cautiously, reverently, not quite trusting that it wouldn't be taken away. She was drawing a motorcycle. It was crude. The proportions were off, the wheels were too big, the handlebars angled wrong, but the detail was extraordinary. She'd drawn the cracked headlight cowl, the mismatched saddlebags, the pitted chrome. She was drawing Jax's bike from memory, with the same observational precision that had allowed her to survive 3 years under surveillance. Jax stood in the doorway. Lily didn't look up. She knew he was there. He could tell by the slight change in the tension of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible pause in the movement of her crayon. But she didn't look up. She was giving him the gift of watching without being watched. A permission she had never been granted and was now, for the first time, granting to someone else. He sat down across from her. The chair scraped softly. Webb stood, nodded to Jax, and left the room. The door closed. Lily colored the gas tank blue. A deliberate choice. The tank on Jax's Road King was black, but she was making it blue. She was changing it, making it hers. The first act of creative autonomy Jax had ever witnessed from her. "You came back," she said without looking up. "I came back." She set down the blue crayon, picked up a silver one, started drawing something on the handlebars. A small shape, too small to see from across the table. "Webb said there were other kids," she said. "Like me." "Yeah, there were. Are they out now?" "Every one of them." She nodded. The crayon moved. The silver shape took form, a small, crude star on the handlebar, a decoration that didn't exist on the real bike, but existed now in the world she was building on butcher paper. "My mom," Lily said. The crayon stopped moving. Her hand hovered over the paper. "She's not coming back." "Is she?" Not a question, a confirmation. The gray eyes lifted and found his, and in them Jax saw the thing he'd been seeing since the first night in the diner. An intelligence so fierce and so battered and so desperately underestimated that it made his chest physically ache. She knew, she'd known, maybe not the specifics, maybe not the logbook entry that read asset neutralized, but the essential truth, that her mother was gone and that the man who took her was the man who locked the door and counted her steps. "No," Jax said. "She's not coming back." Lily's jaw tightened. The same tightening Jax had seen in his own reflection 1,000 times. The clenching against a grief too large for the container holding it. She didn't cry. She had taught herself not to cry because crying was data. Crying was monitored. Crying was logged in a book and measured in minutes and seconds by a man who listened through headphones. "It's okay to feel that," Jax said. "However you feel it. There's no tracker, no cameras, nobody's listening." "You're listening." "Yeah, but I'm not writing it down." Something moved across her face. Not a smile. Not yet. But the precursor to a smile. The muscular memory of an expression she hadn't used in so long that her face had to rediscover the mechanics. She picked up the crayon. Resumed drawing. The silver star on the handlebar grew a second point, then a third. It wasn't a star. It was a wing. Jax reached inside his jacket and pulled out the sneaker, set it on the table beside the butcher paper. It sat there between them, small, white, scuffed, warm from his body. The object that had been both promise and proof. Lily looked at it, picked it up, held it for a moment. Then she set it on the floor, slipped her bare foot into it, and tied the lace. "I don't need you to keep it anymore," she said. Jax nodded, and in that moment, In a kitchen that smelled like coffee and engine oil and crayons, something completed itself. Not a transaction, not a debt repaid. A circuit closed. A door opened and walked through and left open behind, so the air could move through it, so the light could get in. The weeks that followed were slow and difficult and unglamorous. The federal investigation expanded daily, consuming newsprint and airtime, and the attention of a public that wanted to be outraged for exactly as long as outrage was comfortable. 14 children entered the child welfare system, a system that had failed every one of them at least once. And the process of finding them real homes, real families, real lives began with the agonizing slowness of a mechanism that was never designed to move at the speed of human need. Lily was placed with a foster family named the Carvers, a farm couple 60 miles from the compound. No connection to Vail, no connection to the network, no connection to anything except 200 acres of soybean fields and a yellow dog named Hank, and the kind of quiet, unperformative decency that doesn't make the news because it's too ordinary to be a story. Jax visited every Thursday. He drove the Road King down the county road and parked in the gravel turnaround by the barn and walked up to the porch where Lily would be waiting, sometimes with a book, sometimes with Hank, sometimes with a drawing she'd made during the week. They didn't talk much at first. They sat on the porch and watched the fields and let the silence between them be something shared rather than something enforced. He got a job. First time in 6 years. A mechanic position at a shop 12 miles from the Carver's farm, working for a man named Gus who didn't care about Jax's record or his patch or his past, only whether he could rebuild a transmission, which he could. He rented a room above the shop, small, clean, with a window that looked out at a parking lot instead of a highway. A fixed point, an address. The first time his life had been attached to geography since he'd left the Marines. He went to meetings. Not AA. He'd done that circuit and burned through it. A veterans group in the basement of a community center in the next town over. Men sitting in a circle on folding chairs, drinking bad coffee, talking about things they'd never told their wives or their mothers or their best friends. Jax didn't speak for the first 4 sessions. On the 5th, he talked about the closet. Not the story he'd told Bear, the facts, the timeline, the operational report. The real story. The one about the dark and the fear and the sound of his mother crying on the other side of the door, and the understanding at 9 years old that the people who were supposed to protect you were sometimes the people you needed protection from. He said it out loud in a room full of strangers, and the world didn't end. The months turned. Lily's foster placement became permanent. The Carvers filed for adoption. The process was long and complicated and involved more paperwork than any of them thought possible. But it moved forward, one document at a time, one court date at a time, one step closer to the legal recognition of something that had already become true in practice. That Lily had a family, and that family was a soybean farm with a yellow dog and a couple who set an extra place at the table every Thursday because a man on a motorcycle was coming for dinner. Jax became a fixture. Not a parent. Nobody pretended that, but a presence. The word Bear had used months ago. A steady presence. He was there for the first day of school, standing at the end of the Carver's driveway at 6:30 in the morning in his leather jacket and work boots, watching a yellow bus carry Lily toward an education that no one was going to monitor or control or log in a book. He was there when she made a friend, a red-haired girl named June, who talked too much and laughed too loud and was, in every possible way, the opposite of the silence Lily had been forced to inhabit. He was there when she had nightmares. Not in the room, but on the porch, because the Carvers called him one night and said she was asking for the man with the motorcycle, and he rode 12 miles in the dark and sat on the porch steps until she fell asleep and was still there when she came down for breakfast. Elias was adopted by a family in the eastern part of the state. The boy with the shaved head and the ice-cold fingers grew his hair out and joined a swim team and sent Jax a photograph through the Carver's mail. A picture of himself standing on a podium at a regional meet, a bronze medal around his neck, a grin so wide it seemed to contain every smile he'd been denied for 1,200 days. Jax pinned it to the wall of his room above the shop, next to the photograph of his mother on the pier. 2 images, 2 lives, the before and the possible after. The trial took 14 months. Marcus Vail was convicted on 37 federal charges. The sentence was long enough that the number of years didn't matter. What mattered was the word consecutive, which meant that the system of locked doors and ankle trackers and logbooks and headphones and the word asset applied to a human child had been recognized officially and permanently as what it was. Purcell received a shorter sentence, but the loss of his badge and his pension and his name, the name that had been on the county sheriff's office for 3 generations, carried a weight that no number of years could match. Judge Wynn died of a heart attack 6 weeks before his trial date, alone in a hospital bed, his family having already publicly disowned him. The law firm was dismantled, 40 attorneys disbarred. The state legislature passed a bill requiring independent oversight of all minor guardian placements, a law that would bear no one's name, because the people who fought for it didn't want recognition. They wanted change. On a Thursday in October, 11 months after the night that 175 motorcycles rolled through a dark forest, Lily turned 8. The Carvers hosted the party. Their farmhouse wasn't big enough for the guest list, so they set up tables in the barn and strung lights from the rafters, and let Hank wander between the chairs, stealing scraps from plates that nobody was guarding too carefully. June was there, being loud. Webb was there, being gentle. Teller was there, having driven 4 hours with a laptop bag over his shoulder and a gift-wrapped telescope because somewhere in his research he'd discovered that Lily had once told a social worker she wanted to see the stars. The Iron Seraphs came. Not all of them. The compound couldn't empty. Bear always kept a rotation home. But 60, 70 riders rolled down the Carvers County Road in a formation that shook the windows of every farmhouse for a mile, their engines thundering across soybean fields that had never heard anything louder than a tractor, their chrome catching the autumn light in a display so overwhelming that Mr. Carver stood on his porch and watched with his mouth open and his hand on his wife's shoulder and his eyes bright. They parked in the field behind the barn, dismounted, walked in. Men in leather and denim carrying gifts wrapped in newspaper because none of them owned wrapping paper, books and stuffed animals, and a hand-carved wooden box from Cade that he'd spent 3 weeks making in the workshop, and that had, burned into the lid in careful letters, the words Lily's Things. Bear arrived last, his Road King gleaming in a way that suggested he'd spent the morning cleaning it, which was something none of them had ever seen him do. He walked into the barn carrying a cake that he'd picked up from a bakery in town, chocolate because Webb had done reconnaissance, and set it on the table with the gentleness of a man placing something infinitely valuable in a position of honor. Lily stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed, not frightened. She'd moved past the point where crowds triggered her surveillance responses, but overwhelmed in the way that a person who has lived in drought experiences rain. Too much, too generous, too alive. Jax found her standing by the barn door, watching the riders mingle with the Carvers' neighbors, watching Hank steal a piece of chicken from Hollis's plate, watching Cade show June how the wooden box's lid worked, watching Bear cut cake with a knife that looked comically small in his enormous hand. "You okay?" Jax asked. Lily looked up at him. 8 years old. Her hair was longer now, and the Carvers had let her choose her own shampoo, a fact she'd reported to Jax with the gravity of someone announcing a treaty. Her gray eyes were different, still watchful, still cataloging, but the surveillance quality had softened into something more like curiosity. She was looking at the world not to assess threats, but to understand it, to find her place in it. "There are a lot of people here," she said. "Yeah. Are they all here for me?" The same question Elias had asked on Purcell's porch. The question that every child locked in every room in every house in the network had earned the right to ask, and that every man who had ridden through the night had earned the right to answer. "Every single one," Jack said. Lily was quiet for a moment. She watched the party. Then she turned and hugged him, arms around his waist, face pressed against the leather of his jacket, the grip fierce and unself-conscious and total. Not the grip of a child performing affection. The grip of a person who has found the fixed point and is holding on because holding on is what you do when the world has finally, after everything, given you something worth keeping. Jax put his hand on the back of her head, felt the warmth of her against his chest where a sneaker had once been, felt the engine of his own heart doing something it hadn't done in 35 years, running smooth. The party went late. The barn lights glowed in the October dark like a lantern in a window, visible from the road, visible from the field, visible from the sky. Music played. Someone had brought a speaker, and the playlist was a haphazard collision of country and rock, and a song that June insisted on because it was her favorite, and nobody had the heart to say no to a red-haired girl with a voice like a foghorn and a smile like sunrise. Later, when the plates were cleared and the kids were running between bikes in the field and the adults were sitting in clusters on hay bales and folding chairs, Bear found Jax leaning against the barn door. They stood side by side. Two men who had seen the worst of what control could do and had chosen, not once but repeatedly, to answer it with presence. "Doreen called the clubhouse," Bear said. "Yeah? She wants to know if you still come by the diner." Jax almost smiled. "Tell her the meatloaf is still terrible." "Tell her yourself, Thursdays." Bear paused. "You're good at Thursdays." They watched the field, the bikes, the children running between them, their laughter carrying across the dark like something weightless and indestructible. Cade was teaching a group of kids how to sit on a motorcycle without tipping it. Reno was arm wrestling Webb and losing on purpose. Teller was already setting up the telescope, aiming it at a sky so full of stars it looked like the universe was showing off. And Lily was with June, walking between the rows of parked Harleys, pointing at each one, telling her friend the names of the men who rode them. She knew every name, every bike, every rider who had pushed his machine through a dark forest on a moonless night because a girl he'd never met was standing at a window counting her steps. Jax watched her move through the field, small, upright, unhurried, her steps uncounted, and understood that the ride he'd been on for 22 years had not been aimless after all. Every mile, every freezing night, every fight, every failure, every morning he'd woken on the side of a highway and convinced himself to keep going. All of it had been pointed here. This barn, this night, this girl. Not because he'd been looking for her, because he'd been becoming the person who could find her. The engines would go quiet eventually. The party would end. The riders would mount their bikes and ride back to the compound or to their cabins, or to whatever stretch of road called them next. The carvers would turn off the barn lights and carry sleeping children into the house. The stars would wheel overhead, indifferent and enormous. And tomorrow would come with its own demands, its own distances, its own doors to open. But tonight, in a barn in the middle of soybean country, 100 broken men and a handful of children who had survived the unsurvivable were sharing chocolate cake and bad music, and the kind of warmth that doesn't come from a heater or a fireplace, but from the simple, radical act of showing up. Lily looked across the field, found Jax's eyes, held up her hand, not waving, not reaching, just holding it up, open, palm out. The same palm that had once been pressed against a cold window in a bare room in a house that was never a home. Jax held his up in return. Two open hands, 40 feet of autumn air between them. And in that space, in that distance, in that silence, everything that mattered. The stars came out. The music played. And somewhere on a dark highway, a motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance, fading slowly, carrying its rider toward whatever came next with the steady, unbroken rhythm of a heart that had finally learned the difference between running away and riding home.